Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep creating these deep dives for you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would mean the world to us, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy this type of content, hit that subscribe button. It keeps you updated and helps us grow this community. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The white powder appeared without warning. In the autumn of 2001, America was already paralysed by fear. The towers had fallen, the Pentagon burned, Flight 93 lay scattered across a Pennsylvania field. The nation moved through those September days in a kind of collective shock, waiting for the next strike that everyone knew was coming. But no one expected it to arrive in the mail. The letters came addressed to news anchors, senators, and postal workers who never asked to be soldiers. Inside each envelope, a substance so refined, so lethal, so precisely manufactured that its very existence raised a question no one wanted to answer. Where did it come from? Not from a cave in Afghanistan, not from a training camp in the desert. The science was too advanced, the process too technical, the access too restricted. This was not the work of foreign enemies. This came from inside. What you're about to hear is not a mystery with a tidy ending. It's not a case file stamped solved with all questions answered. It's the story of an investigation that pointed outward until it couldn't anymore, then turned inward and went silent. It's about institutional explanations that satisfied headlines but not scientists, about a lone suspect who died before defending himself in court, about evidence that remained classified, about a narrative that closed a case without ever opening it to public scrutiny. The official story says one troubled man did this alone, but the science suggests something more complicated. The timeline suggests something more coordinated, and the silence that followed suggests something no one in power wanted to examine too closely. This is the story of the letters that came after, the second wave of terror, the attack that came from within the system designed to protect us, and the conspiracy that asks, what if the most dangerous thing wasn't the anthrax itself, but what the government chose not to tell us about where it really came from? Chapter 1. The First Letters. The phone call came to the newsroom of the New York Post on a Tuesday morning in late September 2001. A staff member had opened the mail. Now she was sick. The editorial assistant, a woman in her 20s who sorted correspondence as part of her daily routine, had handled a letter addressed to the editor. The envelope seemed ordinary, business-sized, pre-printed address label, stamped and postmarked from Trenton, New Jersey. Nothing about it suggested danger. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in block letters, crude, almost childlike penmanship. The message was brief and bizarre. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The spelling errors felt deliberate, the grammar awkward, the message designed to point in one obvious direction, radical Islamic terrorism, still echoing from the attacks 2 weeks earlier. But beneath the text, something else. A fine powder, tan in colour, had spilled from the envelope. The assistant thought it was strange, but not alarming. She brushed it aside and continued her work. By that evening she felt feverish. Within 2 days she was in the hospital with skin lesions forming on her chest and arms. The diagnosis came back quickly: cutaneous anthrax exposure. This was not a hoax. The New York Post was not the only target. On the same day, similar letters arrived at NBC News in Rockefeller Center. One was addressed to anchor Tom Brokaw, another to an assistant in the newsroom. The NBC letters contained the same message, the same powder, the same crude penmanship designed to look like the work of foreign extremists. An assistant at NBC opened the letter intended for Brokaw. Within days, she developed the telltale black lesions of cutaneous anthrax on her hand. A 7-month-old infant who had visited the NBC offices that week was also infected after brief contact with the newsroom environment. At ABC News, letters arrived but were not immediately identified. Staff members began falling ill with mysterious respiratory symptoms. One producer was hospitalised. Investigators would later trace these infections back to unopened mail that had contaminated the building's ventilation system. CBS News received a letter. The envelope was intercepted before anyone opened it, but not before traces of powder escaped into the mailroom. At American Media Incorporated in Boca Raton, Florida, a photo editor named Robert Stevens opened a letter at his desk. He was a 63-year-old man who spent his days laying out tabloid stories about celebrity scandals and unlikely miracles. He had no enemies, no involvement in politics, no reason to believe anyone would target him. 3 days after opening that letter, Stevens was hospitalised with what seemed like a stroke or meningitis. Tests came back positive for inhalation anthrax, the most lethal form of the disease. His lungs were filling with fluid. His organs were shutting down. On October 5, 2001, Robert Stevens became the first person to die from an anthrax attack on United States soil in more than 25 years. By mid-October, the FBI confirmed at least 5 letters as been mailed to media outlets, all postmarked from Trenton, New Jersey, all containing weapons-grade anthrax spores, all designed to spread maximum fear at the exact moment when the nation was most vulnerable. The immediate assumption, driven by the crude messages inside the envelopes, was that this was a continuation of the September 11th attacks, Al-Qaeda or affiliated groups extending their campaign of terror through biological weapons. But experts who examined the spores under electron microscopes saw something that didn't fit that narrative at all. The anthrax was too pure, too refined, too professionally prepared. This wasn't the work of amateurs operating out of desert compounds. This was laboratory-grade material produced by someone with advanced knowledge of microbiology, access to secure facilities, and training in weaponization techniques. The first letters had arrived. The first victims were identified, and the first cracks in the official story were already beginning to show. Chapter 2. The Capitol is hit. On October 9th, 2001, a letter arrived at the Hart Senate Office building in Washington. It was addressed to Senator Tom Daschle, the Senate Majority Leader and one of the most powerful figures in American government. The envelope bore the same Trenton postmark as the media letters, the same crude handwriting, the same bizarre message about penicillin and death to America. But this batch of anthrax was different. When a staff member in Daschle's office opened the envelope, a plume of powder puffed into the air. It dispersed instantly, so fine that it floated like smoke. Later analysis would show that this anthrax had been milled to an almost unbelievable degree of refinement. The spores were 1 to 3 microns in diameter, small enough to bypass the body's natural defences and lodge directly in the lungs. This was not just anthrax. This was anthrax weaponized to military specifications. Within hours, the entire Hart Senate Office building was evacuated. More than 5,000 staff members, senators and visitors were sent home. Hazmat teams in full protective suits swept through hallways with detection equipment. The United States Capitol, the symbolic heart of American democracy, was partially shut down. A second letter arrived at the office of Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. This envelope was never opened. It was intercepted by investigators who had finally realised the scope of what they were dealing with. When examined later in a controlled laboratory environment, the Leahy letter was found to contain anthrax just as refined and deadly as the Daschle batch. Both senators were Democrats. Both held significant power. Both were involved in debates over expanding executive authority in the wake of September 11th. This detail would later fuel speculation about the true motive behind the attacks, but in October 2001, with the nation still reeling from the tower collapses, the focus remained outward. The assumption was still that foreign terrorists were responsible. The FBI opened the investigation under the codename Anthrax and began pursuing leads connected to international extremist networks. Meanwhile, the contamination spread in ways no one had anticipated. The anthrax spores were so fine that they escaped the sealed envelopes and contaminated postal facilities along the delivery route. Workers at the Brentwood Mail Processing Center in Washington began showing symptoms. 2 men, both postal employees, died from inhalation anthrax in late October. Neither had opened an anthrax letter. They had simply sorted mail in a facility where spores had leaked from the envelopes passing through automated machinery. A postal worker in Hamilton Township, New Jersey, near the Trenton origin point, also died. She had never seen the letters, never handled anything suspicious. She had simply been working in a building, where invisible spores circulated through the air. 2 more victims, both elderly women in Connecticut and New York, died from anthrax exposure through mechanisms that were never fully explained. Investigators believe they encountered cross-contaminated mail, envelopes that had passed through the same sorting machines as the anthrax letters and picked up stray spores in the process. By November, the death toll stood at 5. 17 others were confirmed infected. Thousands more were placed on precautionary antibiotic regimens after potential exposure. The United States Postal Service, an institution older than the nation itself, became a vector of biological terrorism. And still, no one knew who had done this or why. The fear moved beyond rational calculation. Mail service slowed to a crawl as facilities were shut down for decontamination. Congressional offices remained closed for months. Businesses installed ultraviolet scanners and fumigation protocols. Ordinary Americans stopped opening letters from unfamiliar senders. The panic that had begun with hijacked airplanes now extended into the most mundane act of daily life, retrieving the mail. In those autumn weeks of 2001, terror was no longer something that happened in New York or Washington or Pennsylvania. It was something that could arrive at your door in your mailbox with your name on it, and the government had no idea how to stop it. Chapter 3. What the anthrax revealed. The samples arrived at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland, in late October. USAMRIID, as it was known, housed one of the most advanced biodefense research programs in the world. Scientists there worked with anthrax, plague, Ebola, and other agents so dangerous that entire wings of the facility operated under Biosafety Level 4 protocols, the highest containment classification in existence. If anyone could identify where the anthrax letters came from, it was these researchers. The initial findings were unsettling. The anthrax was identified as the Ames strain, a variant originally isolated from a dead cow in Texas in 1981. This particular strain had been distributed to fewer than 20 laboratories worldwide, all of them involved in biodefense research. So the Ames strain was known within the scientific community. It was studied, catalogued, and kept under strict security protocols. This was not some naturally occurring outbreak. This was laboratory material. But the real shock came when scientists examined the spores under electron microscopy. The anthrax had been weaponized. Normally anthrax spores clump together in wet, sticky clusters. They're difficult to disperse as an aerosol. They tend to settle quickly and lose potency when exposed to air. In nature, anthrax is dangerous if ingested or if it enters through a wound. But inhalation anthrax is exceptionally rare because the bacteria doesn't easily become airborne in deadly concentrations. The anthrax in the Dashel and Leahy letters was different. It had been treated with a process called milling, which reduced the spore clusters to individual particles just a few microns in diameter. Some samples showed evidence of chemical additives designed to reduce static cling and improve dispersal. The powder floated like talcum. It remained suspended in air for extended periods. It penetrated deeply into lung tissue with terrifying efficiency. This was not the work of someone mixing bacteria in a basement. This was the product of advanced scientific knowledge, sophisticated equipment, and access to specialized facilities. The FBI quietly began asking a new question. How many people in the world could actually produce anthrax like this? The list was short. Weaponizing anthrax to this degree required training in microbiology, access to BSL-3 or BSL-4 laboratory space, knowledge of aerosol dynamics, and familiarity with military-grade production techniques. In 2001, that level of expertise existed in perhaps a few dozen individuals globally. Most of them worked for governments. Many of them worked for the United States government. The conspiracy theory didn't need to invent shadowy organisations or hidden agendas. The facts alone raised the question: if this anthrax came from a secure American laboratory, and if the perpetrator had the skills and access to weaponize it to military specifications, how could this have been the work of a lone individual acting in isolation? Other details deepened the mystery. Genetic analysis showed that the anthrax spores in the letters matched samples stored at Fort Detrick. The FBI eventually identified a specific flask, labelled RMR-1029, which had been maintained in the bacteriology division of USAMRIID since the late 1990s. Whoever prepared the anthrax letters had access to material from that flask. Only a small number of scientists had ever worked with RMR-1029. All of them had security clearances. All of them worked within the biodefense establishment. All of them were, in theory, the very people tasked with preventing biological terrorism. The investigation, which had begun by looking outward at foreign enemies, was now forced to look inward at America's own laboratories. And what investigators found there raised more questions than it answered. Chapter 4. The investigation shifts. In the first weeks after the letters arrived, the FBI pursued international leads with the urgency of a nation at war. Agents traced possible connections to Al-Qaeda. They investigated whether Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq had supplied the anthrax. They followed tips about foreign scientists with grievances against the United States. The assumption, reinforced by the crude messages in the letters and the timing so close to September 11th, was that this attack came from outside America's borders. By early 2002, those leads had gone cold. No foreign lab matched the genetic signature of the Ames strain used in the letters. No intelligence intercepts revealed overseas planning. No informants provided evidence of international bioterrorism plots. The crude handwriting and misspelled threats that seemed designed to implicate Islamic extremists now looked like misdirection. Someone wanted the letters to appear foreign in origin, but the science said otherwise. The FBI officially shifted the focus of the Anthrax investigation inward in the spring of 2002. Agents began interviewing scientists at USAMRIID and other biodefense facilities. They reviewed security logs, access records and personnel files. They conducted polygraph examinations and requested voluntary handwriting samples from researchers who had worked with the Ames strain. The investigation became classified, technical and slow. One early person of interest was a scientist named Stephen Hatfill, a biodefense researcher with a colourful background that included claims of past work in Africa and connections to military research programs. The FBI's interest in Hatfill became public in the summer of 2002, when his apartment was searched and media reports named him as a person of interest. But the case against Hatfill never solidified. He was never charged. No physical evidence connected him to the letters. The handwriting didn't match. He had no clear access to the specific anthrax flask used in the attacks. In 2008, the Justice Department formally exonerated Hatfill and settled a lawsuit he filed over the damage to his reputation, paying him nearly $6 million. The investigation had publicly named an innocent man and destroyed his career. Meanwhile, the actual perpetrator remained unidentified. By 2005, the Anthrax case had become a bureaucratic labyrinth. Hundreds of agents worked on it. Thousands of interviews were conducted. The FBI built complex genetic profiles of anthrax samples and traced the lineage of every flask of Ames strain in every laboratory that had ever received it. And slowly, attention began to focus on one individual, Bruce Ivins, a veteran microbiologist who had worked at USAMRIID for more than 2 decades. Ivins was not an outsider. He was not a radical or a loner with extremist views. He was, by most accounts, a dedicated scientist who had spent his career developing anthrax vaccines and contributing to America's biodefense preparedness. But he had access to flask RMR-1029. He worked late hours alone in the laboratory, and according to the FBI's later claims, he exhibited troubling psychological behaviours in the years before the attacks. In July 2008, as federal prosecutors prepared to indict him, Bruce Ivins died from an overdose of acetaminophen. The death was ruled a suicide. 1 week later, the FBI declared that Ivins had been the sole perpetrator of the Anthrax attacks. The case was closed. No trial was ever held. No evidence was ever tested in court. No defence was ever mounted. The official story said, one troubled man, acting alone, produced the anthrax, mailed the letters, and killed 5 people in an act of domestic bioterrorism. The investigation was over, but for many scientists, journalists, and even some within the FBI, the doubts were just beginning. Chapter 5: The Lone Scientist Narrative. The Justice Department released its final report on the Anthrax investigation in February 2010, nearly 2 years after Bruce Ivins' death. The document was 92 pages long and presented what the FBI called an exhaustive circumstantial case against Ivins. It detailed his access to the anthrax, his laboratory practices, his late-night hours, and his alleged psychological instability. But it offered no physical evidence directly linking Ivins to the letters. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who saw him prepare the spores or mail the envelopes. The case rested entirely on opportunity, access, and behavioural analysis. According to the FBI's narrative, Bruce Ivins had worked with Flask RMR 1029 extensively throughout his career. He was one of fewer than a dozen scientists with regular access to that specific sample. Records showed he had worked unusual late-night hours in the laboratory during the weeks immediately before the letters were mailed. The timing, investigators argued, was suspicious. In September and early October 2001, Ivins logged into the biocontainment suite where the anthrax was stored on multiple evenings and weekends, often staying for several hours. He offered no clear explanation for why he needed to be in the lab during those times. His work logs did not account for what experiments he was conducting. The FBI suggested that Ivins used this unsupervised time to prepare the spores, dry them, mill them into fine powder, and load them into envelopes. But this is where the scientific questions began. Producing weaponized anthrax is not a simple task. The process requires specialized equipment, a lyophilizer to dry the spores, a milling device to reduce them to the correct particle size, and containment procedures to prevent self-exposure. It generates significant quantities of waste material and leaves behind detectable traces in laboratory spaces. Investigators searched Ivins' workspace extensively. They swabbed surfaces, examined ventilation ducts, and tested equipment for anthrax contamination. They found nothing. No anthrax was detected outside the approved storage areas where Ivins and others routinely worked with the bacteria. No hidden cache of powder, no milling equipment, no lyophilizer unaccounted for, no envelopes, no stamps, no printer or copier that matched the lettering on the address labels. The FBI argued that Ivins must have cleaned up perfectly, leaving no trace of the most sophisticated anthrax production ever seen outside of a state weapons program. Critics found this explanation difficult to accept. The report also presented evidence of Ivins' alleged psychological instability. He had a history of depression and had been prescribed psychiatric medications. He expressed paranoia in emails to colleagues. He had been obsessed with a particular sorority and allegedly stalked members in the past. The FBI suggested these behaviours pointed to a troubled mind capable of committing an act of domestic terrorism. But none of this explained the skill and knowledge required to weaponize the anthrax. Ivins' colleagues, many of whom had worked alongside him for years, publicly disputed the FBI's conclusions. They described him as a dedicated scientist, meticulous in his work and deeply committed to vaccine research. Some acknowledged that Ivins had personal struggles, but none believed he possessed the capability or motive to carry out the attacks. A panel of scientists convened by the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the FBI's evidence in 2011 and found that the genetic analysis, while consistent with the anthrax coming from Flask RMR 1029, could not definitively prove that Ivins was the person who prepared and mailed the letters. The panel noted that multiple individuals had access to the flask, and that samples from it had been shared with other laboratories over the years. The case against Bruce Ivins was strong on access and opportunity. but it was weak on evidence and motive. And because Evans died before facing trial, no jury ever weighed the evidence. No cross-examination challenged the FBI's assumptions. No alternative explanation was tested in open court. The lone scientist narrative closed the case, but it did not close the questions. Chapter 6. Why Doubts Begin. The first problem with the official story is capability. Producing the anthrax, found in the Daschle and Lie letters, required expertise that even experienced microbiologists considered extraordinary. The spores were milled to a uniform particle size of 1 to 3 microns. They dispersed with unusual efficiency. Some analyses suggested the presence of silicon-based additives, compounds that reduce electrostatic charge and improve aerosol performance. This was not the kind of work that could be done covertly in a few late-night sessions. Weapons-grade anthrax preparation is a multi-stage process. The bacteria must be cultured in large quantities, harvested, dried under controlled conditions, milled to break up clumps, and treated to enhance dispersal. Each stage requires specialized equipment and generates detectable byproducts. Joseph Michael, a materials scientist at Sandia National Laboratories, examined samples from the Daschle letter using advanced microscopy techniques. His analysis, published in peer-reviewed journals, identified the presence of silicon and oxygen in unusual concentrations within the spore coats. This finding suggested that the anthrax had been treated with a sophisticated additive process. Michael's work raised an uncomfortable question. Could one person, working alone in a laboratory designed for vaccine research, produce material this refined? The FBI maintained that Evans had both the knowledge and the access. But other scientists, including some who worked in bioweapons programs during the Cold War, expressed skepticism. They pointed out that the techniques required to weaponize anthrax to this degree were closely guarded secrets, typically restricted to military bioweapons labs. Even within USAMRIID, not every scientist would know how to mill spores or apply chemical treatments to improve aerosol dispersal. If Bruce Ivins did this alone, he was operating at a level of expertise that exceeded what his job required. And he left no evidence behind. The second problem is motive. Why would a career, scientist, someone who had devoted his life to developing anthrax vaccines, suddenly decide to mail weaponized spores to media outlets and politicians? The FBI suggested that Evans was motivated by a desire to create fear and increase funding for biodefense research. The theory went that by demonstrating the threat of anthrax attacks, Evans hoped to justify continued investment in vaccine development, which was his area of expertise and professional identity. But this motive feels speculative at best. Evans was already employed. Funding for biodefense research was secure, especially after September 11th. He had no clear financial incentive, and the attacks killed people, including postal workers who had nothing to do with policy or funding decisions. If Evans wanted to create a demonstration, why target senators involved in civil liberties debates? Why mail letters during the most politically sensitive moment in recent American history? Why risk killing innocent people? The psychological profile presented by the FBI painted Evans as paranoid and unstable, but instability alone does not explain the precision and planning evident in the attacks. The letters were carefully timed, the targets were strategically chosen. The anthrax was prepared with meticulous attention to detail. This was not the work of someone spiralling into chaos. It was the work of someone executing a plan. The third problem is evidence suppression. Much of the Amerithrax investigation remains classified. Key documents are sealed. Security protocols at USAMRIID and other biodefense facilities are not publicly disclosed. The FBI has declined to release detailed information about who else had access to Flusk RMR 1029 and how samples from it were tracked and controlled. This secrecy makes independent verification impossible. When the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the case in 2011, the panel was limited in what evidence it could examine. Investigators were not given full access to FBI files or laboratory records. Their conclusions were cautious and qualified, noting that while the evidence was consistent with the FBI's theory, it did not constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt. Several scientists who worked with Evans and had direct knowledge of laboratory procedures have publicly disputed the official narrative. They point to weaknesses in the FBI's timeline, inconsistencies in the genetic analysis, and alternative explanations for the late-night laboratory work that the FBI found suspicious. But these dissenting voices have largely been ignored in favour of the simpler story. One troubled man, one closed case, one answer that allows the nation to move on. The doubts persist not because conspiracy theorists are inventing problems, but because the science and the timeline raise legitimate questions that were never fully answered in open court. And the longer those questions remain unanswered, the more uncomfortable the silence becomes. Chapter 7. Institutional Silence. The official closure of the Anthrax case in 2008 did not end the controversy. It simply shifted the debate from criminal investigation to institutional credibility. Within the biodefense community, unease about the FBI's conclusions ran deep. Multiple scientists who had worked at USAMRIID during the relevant period went on the record to challenge key elements of the case. They questioned whether Ivins had the specific technical knowledge to produce spores of the quality found in the letters. They noted that security protocols at Fort Detrick, while not perfect, would have made it difficult for anyone to smuggle out anthrax samples or use laboratory equipment for unauthorized purposes without detection. Yet the FBI maintained that Ivins had done exactly that. One particularly troubling aspect of the case involves access logs and inventory controls. USAMRIID maintained detailed records of who entered biocontainment, areas, when they entered, and what materials they worked with. These logs should have provided a clear trail of evidence showing whether Ivins had the opportunity to prepare large quantities of anthrax without oversight. The FBI cited Ivins' late-night laboratory sessions as evidence of guilt, but those same logs showed that other scientists also worked unusual hours. Biodefense research often involves time-sensitive experiments that require weekend or evening work. Ivins' schedule, while irregular, was not unique. What remains unclear is whether investigators fully examined the access records of other individuals who had worked with Flusk RMR 1029, or whether the investigation, once it focused on Ivins, effectively closed off other lines of inquiry. The classification of key evidence makes this question impossible to answer publicly. Congressional oversight of the Anthrax investigation was limited and late. Several lawmakers requested detailed briefings on the case, particularly after questions were raised about the handling of Stephen Hatfill and the lack of a trial for Ivins. But those briefings were conducted behind closed doors, and their contents remain largely unknown. In 2008, Representative Rush Holt of New Jersey, whose district included the postal facilities where anthrax contamination occurred, called for an independent review of the FBI's investigation. Holt argued that the public deserved a transparent accounting of how the case was handled and whether the conclusions were sound. That review never happened. Instead, the Justice Department released its final report and declared the matter closed. The message was clear: trust the conclusion, accept the explanation, and move on. But trust in institutions requires more than declarations. It requires evidence, transparency, and the opportunity for public scrutiny. The Anthrax case offered none of these. What makes the institutional silence particularly striking is the context in which the attacks occurred. In the autumn of 2001, the United States was in the midst of a national security crisis. The Patriot Act was being debated in Congress. Surveillance programs were being expanded. Military action in Afghanistan was underway, and planning for the Iraq invasion was accelerating. The anthrax letters arrived precisely when fear was highest and skepticism lowest. Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, the two lawmakers who received anthrax letters, were both Democrats who had expressed concerns about expanding executive power without sufficient oversight. Daschle, in particular, was involved in negotiations over the language of the Patriot Act and had pushed for sunset clauses and civil liberties protections. The timing was, at minimum, politically convenient for those advocating maximum security measures. This does not mean the attacks were orchestrated by government officials. No credible evidence supports such a claim, but it does mean that the attacks occurred at a moment when questioning official narratives was culturally and politically difficult. Fear creates compliance, and compliance creates opportunities for changes that might otherwise face resistance. In the weeks after the Anthrax letters, funding for biodefense research increased dramatically. Billions of dollars flowed into laboratory construction, vaccine development, and emergency preparedness programs. USAMRIID expanded. New facilities were built, security protocols were revised, but details of those revisions remain classified. The attacks demonstrated a vulnerability. The response was to invest heavily in the very institutions where the attacks may have originated. This is not inherently suspicious. It is logical to strengthen defences after an attack. But it does raise a question about accountability. If the anthrax came from inside the biodefence establishment, and if the response was to expand that establishment with limited public oversight, who benefits from the official narrative that blames a lone individual rather than systemic failures? The silence is not proof of conspiracy, but it is proof of something else. A preference for closure over clarity, for resolution over revelation, for moving forward rather than looking back too closely at what actually happened. And in that silence, doubt grows. Chapter 8. The Timing Question. The first Anthrax letters were postmarked September 18th, 2001, 7 days after the towers fell. The second batch, containing the more refined and deadly spores sent to Senators Daschle and Leahy, was postmarked October 9th, 1 month after the nation entered a state of emergency. The timing was not accidental. Whoever mailed these letters understood the psychological landscape of America in the autumn of 2001. Fear was already pervasive. Trust in normalcy had been shattered. The population was primed to expect further attacks and to accept extraordinary measures in response. The letters amplified that fear in a specific direction. The crude messages inside, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, were designed to reinforce the narrative that Islamic terrorism remained the primary threat. This, in turn, supported the political and military momentum toward broader conflict in the Middle East. But the science told a different story. The anthrax was American. The strain was American. The weaponization techniques were American. The expertise required was found almost exclusively within American laboratories. If the goal was to create fear and justify aggressive responses, the letters succeeded perfectly. Within weeks of the anthrax attacks, public support for the Patriot Act solidified. The legislation, which had faced some resistance over civil liberties concerns, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in late October. The bill expanded surveillance powers, reduced judicial oversight of intelligence gathering, and granted law enforcement broader authority to detain suspects without charges. Senators Daschle and Leahy, both of whom had expressed reservations about certain provisions of the Patriot Act, received anthrax letters just as the final negotiations were underway. This timing raised uncomfortable questions that were rarely discussed publicly. Were the targets of the anthrax letters chosen specifically because of their positions on civil liberties and executive power? Again, no evidence supports a coordinated conspiracy. But the coincidence is striking enough that ignoring it requires willful blindness. The anthrax attacks also played a role in justifying the invasion of Iraq. In the months following the letters, Bush administration officials repeatedly linked Iraq to biological weapons programs. Secretary of State Colin Powell's infamous presentation to the United Nations in February 2003 included references to Iraq's alleged possession of anthrax and other bioweapons. The American public, still traumatized by the anthrax attacks, was primed to believe that rogue nations or terrorist groups could deploy such weapons. The fear was real. The threat seemed imminent. But Iraq had no connection to the anthrax letters. That fact was quietly acknowledged after the invasion, once no stockpiles of bioweapons were found. But by then, the war was already underway, and the fear generated by the letters had served its purpose. The timing question is not about proving intent, it's about recognizing opportunity. Someone, whether Bruce Evans acting alone or others whose involvement remains hidden, chose to mail weaponized anthrax at the precise moment when it would have maximum psychological and political impact. That choice shaped the course of American history. It justified surveillance expansions that persist to this day. It fueled a war that lasted nearly a decade. It increased funding for biodefense programs by billions of dollars. It created a climate of fear that made dissent feel dangerous and compliance feel patriotic, and it was never fully explained in a court of law. The official story asks us to believe that one troubled scientist working alone happened to choose this exact moment to carry out an attack that aligned perfectly with the political and military objectives of the most powerful institutions in the country. Perhaps that's true, or perhaps the timing was not coincidental at all. Chapter 9. What was never answered? Investigations are supposed to answer questions. The Anthrax investigation raised more than it resolved. Question 1. How did Bruce Ivins produce weaponized anthrax without leaving any trace? The FBI's theory requires that Ivins cultured large quantities of anthrax, dried the spores, milled them to a uniform particle size, and possibly treated them with silicon-based additives to improve dispersal. This process generates contamination. It leaves behind residue on equipment, in ventilation systems, and on work surfaces. Investigators found none of this. Ivins' laboratory space was tested extensively. So were his personal vehicle, his home, and other locations he frequented. No anthrax contamination was detected outside the approved storage areas where he routinely worked. The FBI suggested Ivins might have used equipment that was later destroyed or cleaned so thoroughly that no traces remained. But this explanation strains credibility. Weaponizing anthrax is a messy, dangerous process. Perfect cleanup would be nearly impossible, and if Ivins was skilled enough to clean up perfectly, why did he fail to avoid suspicion in other ways? Question 2. Why were the early assumptions about foreign involvement so confidently promoted? In the first weeks after the letters arrived, government officials and media outlets almost universally assumed the anthrax came from overseas. Al-Qaeda was mentioned repeatedly. Iraq was suggested as a possible source. The FBI investigated foreign scientists and extremist groups, but the science pointed inward from the beginning. Experts who examined the spores in October 2001 knew almost immediately that the anthrax was domestically sourced. The Ames strain was recognized. The weaponization techniques were consistent with American research, yet the public narrative continued to emphasize foreign threats for months. Why the delay in acknowledging what the evidence showed? Was it incompetence, or was it something else? Question 3. Why was the case closed administratively rather than through prosecution? Bruce Ivins was never charged. He never faced trial. He never had the opportunity to defend himself or present alternative explanations for the evidence the FBI collected. His death by suicide in July 2008 gave the FBI an opportunity to close the case without subjecting its conclusions to public scrutiny in a courtroom. The Justice Department's final report, released in 2010, presented the FBI's case. But it was a prosecution brief without a defense response. It was a closing argument without cross-examination. This is not how justice is supposed to work. Even if Ivins was guilty, the public deserved a trial. The evidence deserved to be tested. The doubts and alternative theories deserved to be examined in open court. Instead, the case was closed with a press release. Question 4. Who else had access to Flask RMR 1029? The FBI identified the anthrax used in the letters as genetically consistent with samples from this specific flask maintained at USAMRID. But the flask itself was not a single sealed container. It was a master stock from which samples were drawn and distributed over many years. Laboratory records show that at least 15 scientists had direct access to RMR 1029. Samples from the flask were shared with other laboratories for collaborative research. Inventory. Controls, while detailed, were not perfect. If the anthrax in the letters came from this flask, it does not necessarily mean Bruce Ivins was the person who took it. But once the investigation focused on Ivins, other potential suspects were not publicly pursued. Access logs were not fully disclosed. The possibility that someone else, either working alone or with assistance, could have obtained and weaponized material from RMR 1029 was never explored in detail. Question 5. Why does uncertainty remain decades later? If the case against Bruce Ivins was as strong as the FBI claimed, why do so many scientists, journalists, and even some investigators continue to express doubt? The National Academy of Sciences report in 2011 was careful and measured, but it did not endorse the FBI's conclusions. It noted significant gaps in the evidence and pointed out that the genetic analysis, while suggestive, was not definitive. Several books, investigative reports, and academic papers published since the case closed have raised serious questions about the FBI's methodology, the reliability of behavioural evidence, and the plausibility of the lone actor theory. These doubts are not fringe conspiracy theories. They are expressed by credible experts with direct knowledge of biodefense research and forensic investigation. If the FBI's conclusions were sound, this level of ongoing skepticism would not persist. But it does persist. And it persists because the questions were never fully answered. What makes all of this so unsettling is not the presence of conspiracy theories. It's the absence of definitive answers. The Anthrax case should have been one of the most thoroughly investigated crimes in American history. It involved a sophisticated biological attack on the United States government and media during a time of national emergency. It killed 5 people and traumatized millions more. And yet it ended not with a trial and verdict, but with a death and a report. The unanswered questions linger because the case was closed before it was solved. Chapter 10. The Deeper Conspiracy. Conspiracy theories typically rely on grand narratives of hidden control, secret organisations, and shadowy actors pulling strings behind the scenes. The Anthrax letters conspiracy is different. It's not about proving that a cabal of government officials orchestrated the attacks. It's not about exposing a cover-up by a deep state entity. It's about recognising that the official explanation is incomplete, that the investigation was flawed, and that the systems designed to protect us may have enabled the very threat they were supposed to prevent. This is a conspiracy of institutional failure, not necessarily of intentional malice. Consider what we know with certainty. The anthrax came from a United States biodefense laboratory. The perpetrator had access to secure facilities. The material was weaponized using techniques developed by American military research programs. The attacks occurred at a moment of maximum political sensitivity. The investigation focused on foreign actors until the science made that impossible. A single scientist was named as the sole suspect after his death, avoiding the scrutiny of a trial. None of this requires a vast conspiracy. It only requires recognizing that institutions protect themselves. When something goes wrong inside a secure facility, the instinct is not to expose systemic vulnerabilities. It's to contain the damage, to find an explanation that limits liability, to close the case in a way that doesn't invite deeper questions. Bruce Ivins may have been guilty. The evidence is circumstantial but not impossible. Or he may have been a convenient conclusion, a troubled individual whose death allowed the FBI to close an investigation that was becoming embarrassing and expensive. We don't know because the question was never tested in court, but the deeper conspiracy theory goes beyond Ivins. It asks, what if the anthrax letters exposed a vulnerability so fundamental to America's biodefense infrastructure that acknowledging it would require a complete rethinking of how these programs operate? Biodefense research involves creating and storing the very agents it's meant to protect against. Laboratories across the country house anthrax, plague, smallpox, and other deadly pathogens. Security protocols are supposed to prevent unauthorized access and misuse. But the anthrax letters proved that those protocols failed. Whether it was one person acting alone or multiple individuals involved, the attacks demonstrated that someone with insider knowledge could obtain, weaponize, and deploy biological agents without being detected until after the damage was done. That's a systemic failure, and systemic failures require systemic accountability. But accountability is uncomfortable. It invites lawsuits. It undermines public confidence. It threatens funding. It exposes the gap between what institutions claim to do and what they actually accomplish. The easier path is to blame an individual. Bruce Ivins, troubled and dead, became the answer that allowed everyone to move forward. His guilt meant the system didn't have to change. His death meant no trial would expose uncomfortable details about how biodefense research is conducted and controlled. The conspiracy, if there is one, is not that the government orchestrated the attacks. It's that the government chose closure over truth because the truth was too dangerous to confront. This theory does not require believing in fantastical plots. It only requires understanding how institutions behave when faced with existential questions about their competence and integrity. The Anthrax letters should have prompted a complete overhaul of biosecurity protocols. They should have led to public inquiries into how laboratories are monitored and how dangerous materials are tracked. They should have forced a conversation about whether the risks of biodefense research outweigh the benefits. Instead, the conversation ended with a suicide note that was never made public and a report that satisfied headlines but not scientists. The deeper conspiracy is the one we accept every time we choose convenient answers over uncomfortable questions. It's the conspiracy of silence, the conspiracy of institutional self-preservation, the conspiracy of moving forward without looking back too closely at what actually happened. And it persists because asking too many questions feels dangerous, because doubting official narratives feels unpatriotic, because trusting the system feels easier than confronting the possibility that the system failed. But the questions remain, and they will continue to remain until someone with the courage to ask them is finally given the opportunity to demand real answers in a setting where evidence must be defended and alternative explanations must be considered. That day has not yet come, and the longer it doesn't come, the more the silence speaks. Epilogue. Fear without a face. The letters stopped arriving in late October 2001. No new envelopes appeared. No new victims were infected. The threat, whatever it had been, ceased as suddenly as it began. By November, the panic had started to fade. Mail service resumed. Decontamination efforts wound down. Life began moving towards something resembling normalcy. But the fear never fully left. Americans approached their mailboxes differently after the Anthrax letters. Suspicious packages prompted evacuations. White powder, even if it was baking flour or laundry detergent, triggered emergency responses. The psychological impact of the attacks outlasted the attacks themselves, and the questions never stopped. Who really did this? Why did they do it? How did they do it without being caught in the act? The official answer is Bruce Ivins, acting alone, motivated by psychological instability and professional anxieties. But the official answer doesn't account for the science, the timing, the lack of physical evidence, or the doubts expressed by experts who understood the technical challenges involved. What remains, more than 2 decades later, is not certainty. It's unease. The Anthrax letters conspiracy is not a theory about hidden organisations or shadowy actors. It's a theory about institutional failure and the stories we tell to avoid confronting that failure. It's about the uncomfortable possibility that the greatest danger came not from foreign enemies, but from within the systems built to protect us. And it's about the silence that follows when asking too many questions becomes politically or professionally inconvenient. Some conspiracies are not about secret plots. They're about truths that are too uncomfortable to examine openly. The Anthrax letters revealed a vulnerability that no one wanted to acknowledge. America's biodefense infrastructure could be turned against the country by someone with insider access and expertise. That vulnerability still exists. The laboratories still operate. The materials are still stored. The security protocols have been revised, but the details remain classified. We're told to trust that it won't happen again, but trust requires transparency, and transparency has been denied. The case is closed. The questions remain. And in the space between closure and clarity, fear persists without a face. Not the fear of anthrax itself. The spores are long since cleaned up. The contaminated buildings have been decontaminated. But the fear of what it means when your government closes an investigation without answering the questions. The fear of what it means when scientists who understand the technical details continue to express doubt decades later. The fear of what it means when the official story is accepted, not because it's convincing, but because questioning it feels dangerous. That fear is quieter than panic. It doesn't shut down mail facilities or evacuate office buildings, but it lingers, and it shapes how we think about power, about institutions, about the gap between what we're told and what actually happens behind closed doors. The Anthrax letters arrived in the autumn of 2001 and changed the country in ways that are still being felt. Not because of the deaths they caused, though those deaths were tragic, but because they revealed something about the systems we depend on and the stories we're willing to accept when those systems fail. The letters have stopped. But the conspiracy, if that's what we want to call it, continues in every unanswered question, every sealed document, every refusal to reopen what was closed too quickly. It continues in the silence, and silence in the end is louder than any message scrawled in crude handwriting inside an envelope full of death. The anthrax came from inside, and that truth was too dangerous to confront. So we moved on, but the doubt remains, and it always will. Thanks to Fro for this incredible suggestion. Now let's dive into one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. Picture this. A dimly lit apartment on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco sometime in the mid-50s. The year doesn't matter as much as the atmosphere. Jazz music drifts through the walls from a neighbouring unit. Miles Davis, or maybe Charlie Parker, the kind of cool bebop that makes you feel like you're living in a movie. A man walks through the door, his heart racing with anticipation. He's nervous but excited. He met a woman at a bar downtown, a place with red leather booths and bartenders who don't ask questions. She was beautiful, charming, and after an hour of conversation that felt effortless, she suggested they go somewhere more private. Now he's here. The apartment is decorated strangely, almost theatrically. Velvet curtains in deep purple, odd paintings on the walls, abstract shapes that seem to shift when you look at them too long. A mirror that takes up most of one wall, its surface spotless, reflecting the dim amber glow of table lamps. The woman pours him a drink. Whiskey, neat, just how he likes it. They sit close on a plush couch that's seen better days. He doesn't notice the tiny holes drilled in the ceiling where microphones hide. He doesn't notice the almost imperceptible hum of recording equipment running in the room next door. He has no idea that behind that mirror on the wall, CIA operatives are watching his every move. He has no idea that his drink has been spiked with a dose of LSD, powerful enough to shatter his grip on reality for the next 8 to 12 hours. He has no idea that everything he says and does will be recorded, analysed, and filed away in a government laboratory where men in lab coats will review his breakdown like it's data from a chemistry experiment. This isn't fiction. This isn't a paranoid fantasy cooked up by conspiracy theorists in dimly lit basements. This is Operation Midnight Climax, and it actually happened on American soil, funded by American taxpayers, authorised by American officials who swore oaths to protect and defend the Constitution. The seeds of paranoia. The story begins in the smoking ruins of World War II, when the world split into two armed camps, and the word peace became something of a sick joke. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in an afternoon. It wasn't just about spy satellites and proxy wars, and the constant threat of mushroom clouds blooming over major cities. It was about something far more insidious, far more terrifying, the human mind itself, and the possibility that it could be hijacked, reprogrammed, turned into a weapon. American intelligence officers became obsessed with reports filtering out of communist countries. The details were fragmentary, often contradictory, but the pattern was disturbing. Prisoners of war returning from Korea told strange, unsettling stories. They spoke of interrogation techniques that seemed to break men from the inside out, not through physical torture, though there was plenty of that, but through psychological methods that were harder to understand and impossible to resist. These men described confessions that felt real even though they knew they were false. They talked about being shown evidence of crimes they hadn't committed, and slowly, inexorably, coming to believe they'd actually done those things. Some soldiers came home and couldn't remember entire weeks or months of their captivity. Others remembered everything but claimed that for periods of time they hadn't felt like themselves, as though someone else had been controlling their actions while their consciousness watched helplessly from somewhere deep inside. Were these stories true? Were they exaggerated? Were they the result of trauma and the mind's attempt to make sense of incomprehensible suffering? The CIA didn't know. What they did know was that the possibility of enemy brainwashing capabilities represented an existential threat that couldn't be ignored. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this. If the Soviets, Chinese and North Koreans had developed sophisticated methods of psychological conditioning, methods that could turn captured Americans into propaganda tools or even sleeper agents, then the United States needed to develop the same capabilities, not just to use offensively, but defensively. How could you protect your people against mind control if you didn't understand how it worked? How could you counter enemy techniques if you hadn't explored those techniques yourself? Whether this threat was real almost didn't matter. The belief alone was enough to spark a terrifying arms race, not of missiles and bombs, but of minds. If the enemy could turn American soldiers into puppets, if they could extract secrets through chemical manipulation, if they could program unwilling subjects to become assassins who would kill on command and then forget they'd ever received orders, then America needed those same tools in its arsenal. That was the justification anyway. That was the story told in classified briefing rooms where decisions were made that would ruin countless lives. In the early 1950s, CIA Director Alan Dulles, a man whose resume included helping wealthy Germans move their money during the Nazi era, and who seemed to view morality as something that applied to other people, authorised a sprawling research program that would eventually be known as MK Ultra. The name itself was characteristically cryptic, designed to reveal nothing about the program's true nature. The goal was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. Investigate every possible method of controlling human behaviour through chemical, biological and psychological means. Leave no stone unturned. Let no ethical consideration stand in the way of knowledge. At the centre of this web, pulling strings and signing off on experiments that would make Nazi physicians nod in approval, sat a man named Sidney Gottlieb. He was a CIA chemist with a club foot that gave him a distinctive limp, a stutter that made him seem harmless, and an apparently unlimited capacity for moral compromise. Gottlieb had a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. On weekends, he ran a folk dancing club, twirling and stomping with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved life's simple pleasures. He raised goats on a farm, made his own cheese, and by all outward appearances seemed like an eccentric but harmless academic who'd found his way into government service. But Gottlieb had been given carte blanche to explore the darkest corners of human experimentation. His budget was hidden deep in the CIA's Black Operations Fund, a financial rabbit hole that existed beyond congressional oversight or public accountability. His work was classified at levels that kept even most agency personnel in the dark. Colleagues in other departments knew only that Gottlieb ran something important, and that asking questions about his work was a career-limiting move. And his weapon of choice, the compound that would fuel countless experiments and ruin innumerable lives, was something that had only recently been synthesized in a Swiss laboratory, lysergic acid diethylamide. LSD. The promise of LSD. In the early 50s, LSD was legal, newly discovered, and utterly mysterious. It existed in that strange liminal space where science fiction meets reality, where the impossible suddenly becomes merely improbable. Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann had first synthesized it in the late 30s while researching ergot alkaloids, those strange compounds produced by fungi that grow on rye and other grains. Hofmann was looking for respiratory and circulatory stimulants. What he found instead would change the course of psychiatric research, fuel a counterculture revolution, and become a cornerstone of illegal government human experimentation. The discovery of LSD's psychoactive properties was accidental. Years after the initial synthesis, Hofmann was handling the compound in his laboratory when he absorbed some through his skin. What followed was unlike anything in his experience. Hofmann described a dreamlike state that was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. Vivid hallucinations erupted behind his closed eyes. Reality took on a fluid, malleable quality. His normal sense of self, the stable core of consciousness that tells you who and what you are, underwent a complete dissolution. He felt he was losing his mind, that he might never return to normal awareness. He did return, of course, shaken but unharmed, and immediately recognized that he'd stumbled onto something profound. This wasn't just another pharmaceutical compound. This was something that could fundamentally alter human consciousness itself. The CIA saw potential that went far beyond psychiatric therapy or philosophical exploration. Here was a drug that could shatter perception, dissolve the ego's defences, and leave subjects vulnerable and suggestible in ways that no amount of physical torture could achieve. The questions that consumed Gottlieb and his team of researchers were tantalizing enough to overcome any moral hesitation. Could LSD force someone to tell the truth during interrogation? Could it function as a kind of chemical spotlight that illuminated the dark corners of the mind where secrets hide? Could it erase traumatic memories, allowing operatives to undergo terrible experiences and then have those experiences wiped clean like chalk from a blackboard? Could it plant false memories, creating confusion about what had really happened? Could it break down psychological resistance so completely that subjects would cooperate fully with their interrogators, believing they were doing so of their own free will? Could it turn an ordinary person into an unwitting operative who would carry out orders and then forget they'd ever received them, creating the perfect untraceable assassin? These weren't idle speculations. These were operational questions that demanded empirical answers, and to get those answers, they needed human test subjects, lots of them. People who could be dosed, observed, and studied under controlled conditions without their knowledge or consent. The problem was consent. Even in the early 50s, before the modern framework of research ethics had fully developed, there were rules about human experimentation. No legitimate review board would approve experiments this dangerous, this unethical, this far beyond the boundaries of acceptable science. The experiments proposed under MKUltra made the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study look almost benign by comparison. The solution from the CIA's perspective was elegantly simple. Don't ask for consent. Don't seek approval from review boards. Don't even tell the subjects they're being tested. Find ways to dose people without their knowledge, in environments where their reactions can be carefully observed and documented, and classify the whole operation at levels that ensure nobody outside a small circle of initiated insiders ever learns what's happening. This is where Operation Midnight Climax enters the story, stage left, trailing shadows and moral bankruptcy. The man behind the mirror. George Hunter White was not a scientist. He didn't have a doctorate or spend his days pondering the mysteries of human consciousness. He was a federal narcotics agent with a reputation for getting results by any means necessary, legal or otherwise. Short, stocky, and physically aggressive, White had the build and temperament of a bulldog. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with criminals, informants, drug dealers, pimps, and people who lived in the grey zones of society where law and order are more theoretical than actual. White had worked deep undercover in some of the most dangerous environments imaginable. He'd made dangerous busts that put violent people behind bars. He'd developed connections in organised crime that would prove invaluable for intelligence work. And through it all, he'd developed a certain contempt for bureaucratic niceties, for the rules and regulations that seemed designed to make effective law enforcement impossible. White believed in getting the job done. The details of how you got there were less important than the results. The CIA recruited him precisely because he had no qualms about getting his hands dirty. They needed someone who could operate in moral grey zones, someone who wouldn't lose sleep over the questionable legality or blatant immorality of what they were asking him to do. White fit the profile perfectly. In the spring of 1954, White was given an unusual assignment, even by the standards of Cold War intelligence work. He would create a series of safe houses, a term that usually means secure locations for protecting valuable assets or conducting sensitive meetings, where unwitting subjects could be secretly dosed with LSD and other drugs, while their behaviour was observed, filmed, and recorded in exhaustive detail. The twist, the detail that elevated this from unethical human experimentation to something uniquely perverse, was that these safe houses would be disguised as brothels. The operational logic was sound in a twisted way. Men visiting prostitutes were already engaged in illegal activity in most jurisdictions. They were unlikely to report strange experiences to police. They'd be embarrassed, vulnerable, and easily dismissed if they did come forward. The social stigma associated with visiting sex workers would keep them silent, and the presence of sex workers themselves provided a natural cover for the operation, while also allowing researchers to study how LSD affected sexual behaviour and inhibition. White set to work with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his true calling. He rented apartments in San Francisco, choosing locations in areas where unusual activity wouldn't draw too much attention. Telegraph Hill was perfect, bohemian enough that strange comings and goings would blend into the neighbourhood's general eccentricity, but upscale enough that the men being lured there would feel comfortable. The apartments were furnished with decor that can only be described as garish. Think Bordello meets art student's first apartment. Velvet curtains in deep reds and purples, cheap but exotic-looking furniture, dim lighting that created atmosphere while also hiding the various surveillance equipment, paintings and decorations that seemed just slightly off, slightly wrong, like they'd been chosen by someone who'd heard about interior design but never actually seen a well-decorated room. The centrepiece of each safe house was a two-way mirror installed in the bedroom. From one side it looked like an ordinary mirror, perhaps unusually large, but nothing that would raise immediate suspicion. From the other side it was a window offering a perfect view of everything happening in the room. Behind these mirrors, CIA operatives would sit for hours, watching, filming, taking notes, documenting every detail of how the drugs affected their unwitting subjects. White hired sex workers to staff these operations. The women, and they were all women, working with male subjects, reflecting both the era's assumptions about sexuality and the operational focus of the research, were told they were working for the government, conducting important research that would help protect American national security. Most of them had criminal records related to prostitution. White offered them good money, regular work, and in some cases immunity for past legal troubles. For women used to operating on the margins of society, constantly at risk of arrest and prosecution, this must have seemed like an incredible opportunity. They were trained in how to lure men back to the apartments, how to make them feel comfortable, and most importantly, how to dose their drinks without arousing suspicion. The dosing had to be subtle. Too obvious, and the subject might refuse the drink or become suspicious. The women became expert at palming pills, at pouring drinks with practiced misdirection, at keeping conversation flowing while they spiked cocktails with substances that would soon tear apart their client's grip on reality. The men who entered these apartments, walking through those doors with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, thought they were paying for sex. Instead, they became unwitting guinea pigs in a government mind control experiment that would have been considered science fiction if someone had proposed it in a novel. Behind the mirrors, CIA operatives watched and filmed everything. The observation rooms were cramped, dark, and smelled of stale cigarettes and instant coffee. Agents sat in uncomfortable chairs, eyes fixed on the scenes unfolding on the other side of the glass, notebooks open, cameras rolling. The men's drinks would be spiked with LSD, sometimes combined with alcohol to enhance the drug's effects, or barbiturates to study how different substances interacted, or marijuana to see if the combination made subjects more suggestible. Then the watchers waited to see what would happen. This was the heart of the experiment, observing human beings as they lost their grip on reality, documenting their responses, cataloguing their fears and revelations, treating consciousness itself as just another variable to be measured and manipulated. Would the men become more talkative, revealing secrets or confessing to things they'd normally keep hidden? Would they become paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, reacting to phantoms? Would their inhibitions dissolve completely, engaging in behaviour they'd normally suppress? Would they become violent, lashing out at perceived threats? Would they become suggestible, accepting instructions or ideas they'd normally reject? Would they become catatonic, collapsing into unresponsive states as their minds struggled to process the overwhelming sensory distortion? Every reaction was noted with clinical detachment. Every word was recorded on reel-to-reel tape machines, the magnetic ribbon capturing confessions, screams, rambling monologues, and terrified pleas. Hidden cameras, state-of-the-art for the era but primitive by modern standards, captured footage that would later be reviewed frame by frame by analysts at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, men who would watch other men's worst moments and take notes like they were observing laboratory rats. The whole operation had a veneer of scientific methodology. There were protocols, forms to fill out, data to be collected and analysed. But strip away that veneer, and what remained was something much darker. State-sanctioned voyeurism mixed with psychological torture, human experimentation that crossed every ethical line, and a profound contempt for the rights and dignity of American citizens. Inside the safe house. Let's slow down and really examine what happened inside these apartments. The clinical description doesn't capture the horror of the experience for those who lived through it. We need to get closer, more visceral, to understand what Operation Midnight Climax actually meant for its victims. Imagine being one of those men. You've met an attractive woman at a bar in North Beach or the Tenderloin, one of those places where sailors and workers and businessmen mix together in the democratic anonymity of alcohol and dim lights. She's engaging, funny, seems genuinely interested in you. In an era where women were expected to be demure and passive, her forwardness is exciting. She laughs at your jokes. She touches your arm when she talks. After an hour of conversation that feels natural and easy, she leans close and suggests going back to her place. Your heart races. You're nervous. You've never done anything like this before, or maybe you have, but it still makes you anxious. But you agree. You pay your tab, leave the bar together, walk through San Francisco streets still busy despite the late hour. She takes you to an apartment building on Telegraph Hill, upstairs that creak, down a hallway where you can hear jazz music and muffled conversations from neighbouring units. The apartment door opens and you step into a world that seems slightly unreal. The decor is strange, too deliberately bohemian, like a stage set. There are velvet curtains, paintings of abstract shapes, furniture that's simultaneously plush and worn. A mirror dominates one wall, its surface reflecting the amber glow of table lamps. The whole space has an odd quality. like it exists slightly outside normal reality. You notice this peripherally, but don't dwell on it. You're focused on the woman, on the anticipation of what's about to happen. She offers you a drink. Whiskey, perhaps, or gin. You say yes. She moves to a small bar in the corner, her back to you, and you hear the clink of glass, the splash of liquid being poured. She returns with 2 glasses, hands you one, sits close on a couch that's seen better years of use. You talk. You drink. The whiskey burns pleasantly as it goes down. You don't notice anything unusual about the taste. Why would you? The dosage has been calculated carefully. Just enough LSD to have profound effects, but not so much that it overwhelms the flavour of whatever alcohol it's mixed with. The women working for White have become expert at this, knowing exactly how to mask the drug's presence. 30 minutes pass, maybe 45. You're feeling good, relaxed, the alcohol warming you from inside. And then, subtle at first, things begin to change. The edges of your vision seem to shimmer, colours become more vivid, more saturated, as though someone has adjusted the contrast on reality itself. The woman's face takes on an odd quality, simultaneously familiar and strange. The paintings on the wall seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, shapes shifting and flowing like they're alive. You shake your head, trying to clear it. Maybe you drank too fast. Maybe the whiskey was stronger than you thought. But the sensation intensifies. The walls seem to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with your heartbeat. Patterns emerge from the textured wallpaper, complex geometric designs that couldn't possibly be there but are undeniably present. The ambient sounds, the jazz from next door, the distant street noise, your own breathing, take on a crystalline quality. Each sound distinct and impossibly clear. Your sense of self begins to fragment. This is perhaps the most terrifying part, harder to describe than the visual distortions. That stable sense of being you, the continuous thread of consciousness that's been constant your entire life, starts to unravel. You're simultaneously yourself and watching yourself from outside, unable to reconcile these two perspectives. Time loses all meaning. Seconds stretch into eternities. Or maybe hours have passed in what felt like moments. You can't tell, and the inability to tell is itself terrifying. The woman you came here with, the woman whose name you now can't remember, seems to transform. Sometimes she appears sinister, her face shifting into a mask of malevolence. Sometimes she seems angelic, glowing with an inner light that makes you want to weep at her beauty. Sometimes she doesn't seem quite human at all, more like an idea of a person, a symbol representing something you can't quite grasp. And through it all, though you don't know it, men in suits are watching from the other side of that mirror. They're taking notes on your breakdown, recording your reactions, treating your terror and confusion as data points to be analysed. You're not a person to them. You're subject 17 or case number 43, a biological system responding to chemical stimuli. The experience varies wildly from person to person. Some subjects had relatively benign trips, if such a thing exists when you're drugged without consent and under surveillance. They giggled through harmless hallucinations, marvelled at the strange beauty of altered perception, and eventually came down feeling shaken but not permanently damaged. Others weren't so lucky. Some experienced psychological breaks that lasted for days or weeks. They reported seeing demons, being pursued by malevolent entities, experiencing their own death over and over in an infinite loop of terror. Reality splintered into fragments they couldn't reassemble. The fear didn't end when the drug wore off. It lingered, colouring everything, making them question whether they could trust their own perceptions ever again. Some subjects became violent, lashing out at perceived threats that didn't exist. The women working these operations were sometimes injured, though this rarely made it into official reports. The CIA was more concerned with data collection than worker safety. Others became catatonic, collapsing into unresponsive states as their minds simply couldn't process the overwhelming sensory distortion. They'd sit motionless for hours, eyes wide and unseeing, while the watchers behind the mirror documented their condition with clinical detachment. The psychological aftermath was often severe. Men left these apartments confused, traumatized, unable to fully articulate what had happened to them. Many reported lasting paranoia, a persistent sense that they were being watched or followed. Relationships crumbled. Some men lost their jobs, their behaviour having become too erratic for employers to tolerate. A few ended up institutionalised, diagnosed with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses that may have been triggered or exacerbated by their unwitting participation in Operation Midnight Climax. None of them had consented to any of it. None of them understood what had been done to them, and for decades, nobody would believe their stories because the truth was too outrageous to be credible. The internal testing. Here's the truly chilling part, the detail that transforms this from unethical experimentation into something approaching collective insanity. The CIA didn't limit their testing to strangers picked up in bars and dosed in fake brothels. Internal documents later revealed that agency personnel also dosed each other without warning, slipping LSD into coffee during meetings, spiking punch bowls at office parties, even dosing colleagues just to see how they'd react under pressure. The reasoning, such as it was, went like this. Operatives needed first-hand experience with LSD so they could recognise its effects if an enemy ever used it against them. They needed to know what the drug felt like, how it altered perception and cognition, so they wouldn't be caught completely off guard if they were dosed in the field. This logic, already dubious, didn't account for the fact that being unexpectedly dosed in a familiar environment by people you trusted was arguably more traumatic than being dosed by an enemy. At least with an enemy, you knew where you stood. But having your own colleagues drug you without warning shattered the most basic foundations of workplace trust and safety. The culture within the MKUltra program became increasingly bizarre and reckless. Stories circulated about CIA officers showing up to work never quite sure if their morning coffee had been spiked. Some operatives apparently developed paranoia about office refreshments, bringing their own drinks in sealed containers, treating communal coffee pots with a suspicion usually reserved for foreign agents. One case stands out for its tragic consequences and the questions it raised about the program's true nature. Frank Olson was a CIA officer working in the agency's Biological Warfare Division. In November of 1953, Olson attended a retreat with other CIA personnel at a lodge in Western Maryland. The retreat was supposed to be a team-building exercise, a chance for officers to relax and strengthen their working relationships. On the second night, Sidney Gottlieb, who was attending the retreat, spiked the after-dinner drinks with LSD. Nobody was warned, nobody consented. The drug took effect while the men were relaxing, socialising, letting their guard down in what they thought was a safe environment. Most of the officers experienced the trip and recovered, though several later reported lingering psychological effects. But Olson had a severe adverse reaction. He became increasingly agitated, paranoid and depressed. The symptoms didn't resolve as the drug wore off. Instead, they intensified. Olson became convinced he'd made grave professional errors. He talked about quitting the agency. His colleagues and superiors grew concerned about his state of mind and what he might reveal in his deteriorated psychological state. A week after the retreat, Olson was in New York City, supposedly under the care of a CIA physician who specialized in managing LSD-related complications. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Olson crashed through the closed window of his hotel room on the 13th floor and fell to his death on the sidewalk below. The official story called it suicide, a tragic consequence of underlying mental health issues exacerbated by LSD. But Olson's family never believed this explanation. They spent decades fighting for the truth, demanding investigations, challenging the CIA's narrative. Their persistence eventually forced the release of previously classified documents that raised disturbing questions about what really happened that night. Some of these documents suggested Olson had been expressing serious ethical concerns about the biological weapons research he was involved in. Others indicated that his erratic behaviour after being dosed had made him a security risk in the eyes of his superiors. There were hints that the CIA feared he might go public with what he knew about the agency's more questionable activities. The question that haunts researchers and Olson's surviving family members is whether his death was really a suicide or whether he was murdered, pushed from that hotel window by people who decided he'd become too much of a liability. We'll probably never know for certain. The witnesses are dead, the evidence is contradictory, and the agency has no incentive to reveal anything that would implicate its personnel in murder. What we do know is that Frank Olson's death marked a turning point. It forced some internal recognition that the MKUltra experiments were spiralling out of control, that the casual dosing of personnel had gone from questionable research to dangerous recklessness. But this recognition didn't lead to meaningful reform or accountability. It led to better operational security, more careful documentation, and increased efforts to ensure that if things went wrong, they could be covered up more effectively. The descent into depravity, the moral rot at the heart of Operation Midnight Climax extended beyond the central mission of dosing unwitting subjects. George Hunter White's personal diary, which surfaced years later during congressional investigations, provides a disturbing window into the mindset that prevailed among those running the operation. In one particularly chilling passage, White wrote, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Read that again. This wasn't a moment of reflection or regret. This was celebration. White was expressing joy, almost glee, at having found a situation where normal moral constraints didn't apply. The All-Highest he referenced was the CIA, the intelligence apparatus that had given him license to operate outside the law and beyond ethical boundaries. The diary entries paint a picture of a man intoxicated, not just by the alcohol he consumed in vast quantities, but by power and moral license. White hosted parties at the safe houses where CIA officers, visiting dignitaries, and selected guests would drink heavily and watch the proceedings behind the mirror like it was entertainment. These weren't scientific observations conducted with professional detachment. They were viewed as a show, a spectacle, a form of voyeuristic entertainment that happened to generate data as a side effect. The line between intelligence work and personal indulgence blurred completely and then disappeared altogether. White decorated one of the safe houses with a photograph of himself, sitting in front of a table covered with various drugs and paraphernalia, grinning at the camera like a kid showing off his toys. The image captured something essential about the operation. This wasn't grim, but necessary work done reluctantly in service of national security. This was something its participants enjoyed, something they found thrilling and liberating. Taxpayer money funded not just the drugs and surveillance equipment, but also the lavish lifestyle White cultivated around these operations. The CIA covered the rent on multiple apartments, paid the sex workers generous wages, provided unlimited alcohol, and financed White's personal entertainment. The official designation was behavioural research, a term that made it sound scientific and serious. The reality was much uglier. A government-funded party where drugging and manipulating American citizens was treated as sport. The drugs used weren't limited to LSD, though that remained the primary focus. White's team experimented with a disturbing array of substances, often combining them in ways that pushed subjects to psychological breaking points. Amobarbital, a barbiturate sedative, was used to create states of reduced inhibition and increased talkativeness, the so-called truth serum effect that interrogators had long sought. Subjects under the influence of amobarbital would become drowsy, compliant and talkative, sometimes revealing information they'd normally keep hidden. Marijuana was tested in various combinations, with researchers interested in whether it enhanced suggestibility or reduced anxiety in ways that could be exploited during interrogation. Sodium pentothal, another barbiturate with supposed truth serum properties, was administered to subjects to see if it could be used to extract reliable information. But the most disturbing experiments involved combining multiple substances. LSD mixed with alcohol created unpredictable effects, sometimes inducing terrifying hallucinations, sometimes creating a manic euphoria that dissolved all inhibitions. LSD combined with barbiturates could produce a strange state, where subjects were simultaneously hallucinating and sedated, trapped in vivid nightmares they couldn't wake from. Some cocktails were designed to maximize fear responses, pushing subjects into states of terror that lasted hours. There was no medical oversight, at least not in any meaningful sense. The CIA had physicians on staff who were technically supervising the experiments, but these were doctors who'd already compromised their Hippocratic oaths by participating in unethical human experimentation. They weren't there to protect the subjects' well-being. They were there to ensure subjects didn't die in ways that would create complications for the agency. No one was checking on the well-being of the subjects after they left the safe houses. No one monitored them for long-term psychological or physiological effects. No protocol existed for what to do if someone had a medical emergency or complete psychological breakdown that lasted beyond the expected duration of the drug's effects. The attitude seemed to be that these were expendable people, criminals and deviants who'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time, men whose suffering was acceptable collateral damage in the name of national security. This raises an uncomfortable question about the nature of evil. We like to think of evil as dramatic, as something done by obvious villains with clear malicious intent. But Operation Midnight Climax demonstrates how evil can be banal, bureaucratic, hidden behind clipboards and requisition forms and budget line items. The people running these operations weren't cackling supervillains. They were government employees with families and hobbies, people who went home at night and had dinner and probably considered themselves patriots serving their country. They'd simply found a way to compartmentalise the harm they were causing, to separate the human consequences of their actions from the abstract goals they were pursuing. The network expands. By the late 1950s, the operation had expanded well beyond the initial San Francisco safe house. White established another operation in New York City, tucked away in Greenwich Village, that bohemian enclave where artists and writers and people living on the margins could exist without drawing excessive attention. The New York safe house followed the same basic playbook: hire sex workers, rent a discreet apartment, install surveillance equipment, and start dosing unwitting subjects. But the New York operation had its own distinctive character. Greenwich Village in the 50s was a creative ferment, a neighbourhood where beat poets read in coffee shops and jazz musicians played in basement clubs, and people talked about art and politics until dawn. The safe house blended into this environment perfectly, just another odd apartment in a neighbourhood full of odd apartments. The New York operation also drew a somewhat different clientele than San Francisco. While the West Coast safe houses primarily caught sailors, workers, and small-time businessmen, the New York location saw artists, writers, musicians, and occasionally people with more significant public profiles. There's speculation, impossible to verify because the records were destroyed, that some relatively prominent cultural figures were dosed in the Greenwich Village safe house. If true, the potential for blackmail would have been enormous. Additional sites may have operated in other cities, though documentation is sparse and contradictory. Some researchers believe safe houses existed in Washington, D.C., allowing the CIA to potentially target politicians and government officials. Others point to suggestive evidence of operations in Los Angeles and Chicago. The truth is, we'll never know the full extent of the program, because the systematic destruction of records in the 70s ensured that many secrets stayed buried. What we know for certain is that by the late 50s, multiple safe houses were active simultaneously, processing dozens, if not hundreds, of subjects each year. The scale of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over the course of its existence, Operation Midnight Climax dosed several thousand men without their knowledge or consent. The actual number could be significantly higher. Inside CIA headquarters at Langley, this was still framed as cutting-edge behavioural science. Gottlieb and his team received regular reports from the safe houses, delivered in unmarked folders through secure channels. They analysed the recordings, looking for patterns and insights that could be weaponized. Which drug combinations produced the most suggestibility? Under what conditions did subjects reveal secrets? Could terror be induced reliably and controlled precisely? Could the effects of LSD be channeled in useful directions, or was the experience too chaotic to be operationally valuable? The research generated reams of data, most of which was ultimately judged to be of limited practical value. LSD, the agency reluctantly concluded, was not a reliable truth serum. People under its influence were highly suggestible, but they were also likely to confabulate, mixing reality with fantasy in ways that made their statements unreliable. The drug could break down psychological resistance, but it did so by shattering the mind's normal functioning so thoroughly that extracting useful information became nearly impossible. This didn't stop the experiments. Even as evidence mounted that LSD wasn't the miracle interrogation tool they'd hoped for, the program continued. This persistence suggests that for many involved, the research itself had become the point. The operation had taken on a life of its own, justified by momentum and institutional inertia as much as by any actual intelligence value. But something else was happening too, something that would only become clear later when investigators started piecing together the full story. The agents and officers involved in Operation Midnight Climax began treating the safe houses as private clubs, places where they could indulge appetites and behaviours that normal society constrained. George Hunter White kept detailed logs of who visited the safe houses and when. These logs, partially recovered during later investigations, show that many visits had no clear research purpose. CIA officers would show up not to conduct experiments but to drink, socialise and indulge in the voyeuristic thrill of watching people lose their grip on reality. Some brought guests showing off the operation like it was a particularly exotic tourist attraction. The safe houses became a kind of shadow perk for CIA personnel, a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where you could watch human beings at their most vulnerable and tell yourself it was for the greater good. White would invite colleagues to come watch the show, and they'd spend evenings drinking and observing like Romans at the Colosseum, treating other people's suffering as entertainment. Reports suggest that the safe houses were also used for activities that had nothing to do with official CIA business. Some personnel allegedly used them for assignations, taking advantage of the apartments and the available sex workers for personal gratification. The line between official operations and personal pleasure dissolved entirely. The program had metastasized from dubious research into something that resembled organised abuse with government funding. And nobody was stopping it because everyone involved had reasons to stay quiet, whether from fear of ending a career-making operation or fear of being implicated in activities that, if exposed, would destroy careers and possibly result in criminal charges. The beginning of the end. By the early 60s, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The CIA was still riding high from its Cold War successes, still operating with the confidence of an organisation that believed itself above accountability. But even within this culture of moral flexibility, Operation Midnight Climax was starting to look indefensible. Internal CIA memos from this period, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, show growing concern among mid-level administrators. These weren't bleeding heart liberals troubled by abstract ethical considerations. These were practical intelligence officers worried about operational security and legal liability. The questions they raised had nothing to do with the morality of dosing citizens without consent and everything to do with the practical problems this created. What happens if a subject dies during an experiment? What's the agency's legal exposure? What if someone with a pre-existing medical condition has a catastrophic reaction to LSD? What if a subject figures out what happened and goes to the press? What if foreign intelligence services learn about the safe houses and use that information for propaganda purposes. The memo writers were concerned about consequences, not ethics. But even this limited form of accountability was enough to start the process of shutting down the operation. The CIA's Inspector General's office conducted a review in the early 60s and found what amounted to a rogue operation with minimal scientific value and enormous legal liability. The Inspector General's report, portions of which survived the later purge of documents, made for damning reading. It concluded that the dosing of unwitting subjects violated every principle of medical ethics that had been established in the wake of the Nuremberg trials. The use of sex workers and the creation of fake brothels crossed lines that even Cold War spy masters, men not known for their squeamishness, found uncomfortable when documented in official reports. The research, the report noted dryly, had produced little actionable intelligence. Experiments had confirmed that LSD was a powerful hallucinogen that could temporarily incapacitate people and make them highly suggestible. But these effects were too unpredictable and difficult to control to be useful in operational settings. You couldn't dose an enemy agent and reliably extract specific information. You couldn't program someone to carry out specific tasks and then forget about them. The drug was simply too chaotic, its effects too dependent on individual psychology and environmental factors. In other words, they'd been drugging American citizens for almost a decade, ruining lives and traumatizing hundreds, if not thousands of people, for research that had limited practical value. Even from a coldly utilitarian perspective, divorced from any moral consideration, the operation was a failure. In 1963, orders came down to shut it all down. The safe houses were to be quietly closed. Equipment was to be removed and either destroyed or transferred to other facilities. The sex workers were to be paid off and told, with whatever mixture of bribery and intimidation was necessary, to forget everything they'd seen. The whole operation was to be wrapped up and buried in classified archives where it would, ideally, never see daylight. White retired from government service shortly thereafter. He'd had a long career in law enforcement and intelligence, had worked operations that would have destroyed lesser men, and now he was done. He moved to California, settling in Stinson Beach, where he lived quietly for the remainder of his life. He never faced charges for his role in Operation Midnight Climax. Neither did anyone else involved in the operation. There were no courts-martial, no criminal prosecutions, no professional sanctions. The attitude within the CIA seemed to be that White and his team had simply been following orders, conducting research that higher-ups had authorized and funded. For more than a decade, Operation Midnight Climax remained hidden, buried in classified files that were locked in secure vaults, known only to a small circle of CIA insiders who had every reason to keep quiet. The victims had no idea what had been done to them. The public had no inkling that their government was capable of such activities. And the people responsible slept soundly, convinced they'd done difficult but necessary work in defense of national security. The truth emerges. The truth began to emerge in the mid-70s, during a period of unprecedented scrutiny of American intelligence agencies. The Vietnam War had shattered public trust in government. Watergate had exposed criminal behaviour at the highest levels of power, proving that conspiracy theories weren't always paranoid fantasies. Americans were asking hard questions about what their government had been doing in the shadows, and they weren't accepting national security as an automatic conversation ender anymore. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, launched a sweeping investigation into domestic intelligence activities in 1975. The committee had broad subpoena power and a mandate to expose government abuses. Around the same time, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller chaired a commission examining similar issues, though with somewhat less aggressive investigative zeal. What these investigations found was staggering, almost beyond belief. The CIA hadn't just been spying on American citizens, though they'd done plenty of that. They'd been conducting psychological warfare experiments on the domestic population. They'd been dosing people with powerful drugs. They'd been working with organised crime. They'd been running brothels on American soil. The scope of the abuses was so vast that it was almost incomprehensible. MKUltra, the investigations discovered, wasn't just one program but an umbrella for dozens of sub-projects, many of them involving unethical and sometimes horrifying human experimentation. Universities had been used as testing grounds, with professors dosing students without their knowledge. Prisons had been turned into laboratories, with inmates offered reduced sentences in exchange for participating in experiments that often caused lasting harm. Mental institutions had been co-opted, with patients subjected to treatments that had more to do with breaking minds than healing them. Operation Midnight Climax was among the most egregious sub-projects, but it was far from alone. The breadth of MKUltra suggested a systemic problem, a complete breakdown of ethical constraints and oversight mechanisms that had allowed intelligence personnel to pursue virtually any avenue of research without accountability. In 1977, following the Church Committee revelations, the CIA declassified thousands of pages of MKUltra documents. Journalists and researchers pored over the files, and gradually the full scope of Operation Midnight Climax came into focus. The sanitized language of official reports couldn't quite hide the horror of what had been done. Survivors began coming forward, encouraged by the investigations and by the realization that they weren't alone, that others had experienced similar inexplicable trauma. Some described being drugged and disoriented, waking up hours later in unfamiliar surroundings with no clear memory of what had happened, only fragmentary impressions of terror and confusion. Others spoke of lasting psychological damage, of paranoia that never fully went away, of relationships destroyed by behavioural changes they couldn't explain or control, of careers derailed by psychological instability they couldn't trace to any source. One man, testifying before investigators, described an experience in a San Francisco safe house that had haunted him for over 2 decades. He'd gone back to an apartment with a woman he'd met at a bar, had a drink, and then reality had come apart. He remembered walls that breathed, faces that melted, hours of terror where he was convinced he was dying or going insane. When he finally came down and left the apartment, confused and shaken, he tried to put the experience behind him, but it wouldn't stay behind him. For years afterward, he suffered from nightmares, panic, attacks, and a persistent sense that reality wasn't quite stable, that it might shatter again at any moment. His marriage fell apart, he lost his job, he spent time in psychiatric facilities, and for most of that time, he had no idea what had actually happened to him. No framework for understanding why a single night had demolished his life so completely. Another survivor talked about how a single night of unknowingly consuming LSD had triggered latent mental illness that plagued him for decades. He'd had no history of psychological problems before that night. Afterward, he struggled with symptoms that doctors diagnosed as schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, paranoid ideation, difficulty distinguishing reality from delusion. He'd spent years on antipsychotic medication, in and out of hospitals, his life effectively destroyed. When he learned about Operation Midnight Climax, pieces started to fall into place. The symptoms had started immediately after that confusing, terrifying night in an apartment he could barely remember. He'd been dosed, his brain chemistry altered in ways that triggered a cascade of psychological problems. But there was a massive problem with the survivors coming forward, and the investigations trying to piece together what happened. Most of the records had been deliberately destroyed. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal consumed Washington, and it became increasingly clear that intelligence agencies would soon face unprecedented public scrutiny, outgoing CIA Director Richard Helms made a fateful decision. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files, everything. The research data, the experimental protocols, the surveillance footage, the audio recordings, the administrative records, all of it was to be eliminated. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Boxes of documents were shredded into confetti. Reels of magnetic tape were erased. the recordings of men's worst moments electronically obliterated. Film canisters were opened and their contents burned. Thousands of hours of footage turned to ash and smoke. The goal was to make it as though MKUltra had never existed, to eliminate any evidence that could be used to hold individuals accountable or prove the full extent of the program's abuses. The destruction was so comprehensive that investigators in the 70s could only piece together fragments of what had really happened. The true number of victims, the full extent of the experiments, the complete list of safe house locations, the names of everyone involved, all of it vanished into industrial shredders and incinerators. The history of Operation Midnight Climax exists now only in outline, with the details lost forever. What survived was largely accidental. Some documents had been mislabeled and filed in the wrong places, allowing them to escape the purge. Financial records, which were kept separately and overlooked during the destruction order, provided a paper trail showing how much money had been spent and where it had gone. And most importantly, the testimony of people who'd been there, who'd participated or been victimised, provided first-hand accounts that no amount of document shredding could eliminate. These fragments were enough to confirm that Operation Midnight Climax had happened, that the core accusations were true, that the government really had drugged citizens in fake brothels and called it research. But the gaps in the record remained frustrating and troubling. We know what happened in broad strokes, but the specific details, who exactly was victimised, what precisely was done to them, who gave which orders and when, are lost. The conspiracy deepens. As researchers dug deeper into the fragmentary evidence, examining what had survived the purge and interviewing everyone they could find who had knowledge of the program, a disturbing pattern emerged. Operation Midnight Climax may not have been primarily about LSD research at all. The drug testing might have been cover for something else entirely. Blackmail. Think about the operational reality. The CIA was secretly filming prominent men in compromising sexual situations, while those men were under the influence of mind-altering drugs. Every session created potential blackmail material. Get someone on film in a San Francisco safe house, engaging in activities they'd never want made public, saying things they'd never want attributed to them, and you own them. You have leverage that can be used to secure cooperation, extract favours, or simply ensure silence. The blackmail theory isn't just speculation. There's circumstantial evidence supporting it. Pieces of a puzzle that, while individually inconclusive, collectively paint a suggestive picture. First, consider George Hunter White's background and connections. He wasn't just a federal narcotics agent. He had extensive ties to organised crime, relationships built over years of undercover work and complicated by the realities of Prohibition-era law enforcement. The mob controlled prostitution in most major American cities. They had their own networks of safe houses and compromising situations used for leverage. White would have been intimately familiar with these tactics. The CIA had a long, documented history of working with organised crime when it suited their purposes. They'd partnered with the mob in attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. They'd used criminal networks to move money and weapons. The overlap between CIA operations and criminal enterprises was far more extensive than most people realise. The safe houses in Operation Midnight Climax closely resembled mob-run honey trap operations. The techniques, using sex workers to lure marks, compromising them in situations they couldn't escape without embarrassment, creating leverage through documentation of illegal or socially unacceptable behaviour, was straight from the organised crime playbook. Second, consider the targets. While many of the men caught in these operations were ordinary citizens, sailors on shore leave, businessmen looking for excitement, workers unwinding after long shifts, there are suggestions that some subjects were chosen more deliberately. The Greenwich Village safe house in particular is rumoured to have attracted or targeted people with public profiles: artists, writers, academics, people whose work or social positions made them potentially useful sources of information or influence. Documentary evidence is sparse because of the record destruction, but there are tantalizing hints. Expense reports that survived show payments for special operations, distinct from the regular brothel maintenance costs. Memos reference priority subjects, without explaining what made them priorities. There are gaps in the recovered financial records during periods when, according to witnesses, the safe houses were particularly active. Third, consider what happened to the recordings. The CIA claims all the footage and audio tapes were destroyed in the 1973 purge, but people who've spent careers studying intelligence agencies are skeptical of this claim. The historical pattern is that truly sensitive material, information that could be used as leverage or might need to be accessed later, doesn't get destroyed. It gets hidden, secured, kept available for potential future use. There are whispers, impossible to verify, that the tapes didn't all end up in incinerators. Some allegedly found their way into private hands, parcelled out to powerful people as insurance, or traded for favours. The logic is grimly practical. If you're holding blackmail material on someone influential, you don't destroy that leverage. You keep it, use it when necessary, and pass it on to ensure it remains useful. There are theories that copies exist in foreign intelligence archives, obtained through spies or defectors who recognise their value. The KGB would have loved to get its hands on footage of American officials in compromising positions. So would other intelligence services. If any of the people involved in Operation Midnight Climax were recruited by foreign powers, the safe house recordings would have been invaluable. Fourth, consider the timing and manner of the operation's closure. The program was shut down in 1963, officially because the Inspector General found it unethical and unproductive. But some researchers note that this was also the year of several significant intelligence scandals and growing congressional scrutiny of CIA activities. Shutting down the safe houses might have been less about ethics and more about removing a potential embarrassment before it could be discovered. The closure was quiet, almost furtive. No announcement, no acknowledgement that anything had been happening. The apartments were simply vacated, the sex workers paid off and warned to stay quiet, the equipment removed. But witnesses, maintenance workers, landlords, neighbours reported something odd. Months and even years after the official closure, mysterious men continued to rent or visit these properties, always using false names, always paying in cash, always somehow connected to private defence contractors or consulting firms with opaque ownership structures. If the CIA really shut down the safe houses completely, who was using them, and for what purpose? The agency has never provided a satisfactory answer. One possibility is that the official shutdown was a bureaucratic fiction, that the operations continued but with even deeper classification and more careful operational security. Another possibility is that the safe houses were transferred to different organisations, private contractors perhaps, or other intelligence agencies that could continue similar activities with less direct CIA involvement and therefore less institutional risk. The safe houses could have served a dual purpose from the beginning: genuine if unethical drug research on some subjects and targeted blackmail operations against others. The drug testing provided cover, a seemingly scientific rationale for activities that might otherwise have been impossible to justify, even within the classified world of intelligence operations. And here's where it gets truly unsettling, where the conspiracy theories start to sound uncomfortably plausible. The techniques pioneered in Operation Midnight Climax closely resemble what intelligence agencies call honey traps, operations where sex, romance, or the appearance thereof is used to compromise and control targets. Throughout the Cold War, both sides used these tactics extensively. The Soviets were famous for it, using attractive agents to seduce Western diplomats and officials, then using photographs or recordings of the encounters to force cooperation. The Americans did the same thing, though perhaps with slightly more euphemistic language in official reports. The safe houses were perfect honey trap facilities. They were designed specifically to create compromising situations that could be documented. The presence of drugs added another layer of leverage. Not only could you threaten to reveal someone's sexual indiscretions, but you could also threaten to expose their drug use, which in the 1950s and 60s carried severe legal penalties and social stigma. Moreover, people dosed with LSD without their knowledge were often uncertain about what had really happened during their experience. The drug's effects included memory problems, confusion about the timeline of events, difficulty distinguishing hallucination from reality. This confusion made victims vulnerable to suggestion. An operative could tell someone, "You said this," or "You did that," and the person, unable to fully trust their own recollections, might accept the claim even if it was false. This created opportunities for manipulation that went beyond simple blackmail into more sophisticated forms of psychological control. The ultimate nightmare scenario, and one that several researchers have explored, is that some of the safe house recordings were used to blackmail people into positions where they could be further exploited. Imagine a politician or businessman caught on film in a San Francisco apartment under the influence of LSD, engaged in behaviour that would destroy his career if revealed. He's approached afterward by people who have the footage. They don't want money. They want cooperation, access, information. Maybe they want him to vote a certain way on particular legislation. Maybe they want inside information about business deals. Maybe they just want him to remain silent about something he's learned. He cooperates, of course. What choice does he have? And once he's cooperated once, they have even more leverage. Now, he's not just someone who did something embarrassing. He's someone who betrayed his principles, who sold out, who collaborated with intelligence agents. The leverage compounds, the trap tightens, and escape becomes increasingly impossible. This isn't wild speculation. This is how intelligence agencies operate. The techniques are documented. The only question is whether Operation Midnight Climax was actually used this way, and if so, on what scale and against which targets. Without the destroyed records, we'll never know for certain. But the operational logic is sound, and the capabilities were clearly in place. The architects escape justice. In any sane world, when Operation Midnight Climax became public, those responsible would have faced severe consequences. At minimum, they should have been fired, disgraced, stripped of security clearances and government pensions. In a truly just world, they would have faced criminal prosecution for crimes including conspiracy, assault, drug trafficking, and multiple civil rights violations. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where power protects itself, where the people who make policy are rarely held accountable for its consequences, where national security functions as a magic phrase that makes accountability disappear. George Hunter White died in October of 1975, just months before the Church Committee revelations would have made his name synonymous with government abuse. He was 71 years old, had lived a full life, died in his sleep in his Stinson Beach home with the Pacific Ocean, providing a soothing soundtrack. He never faced a courtroom, never had to answer hostile questions from investigators or journalists, never had to confront the men whose lives he'd helped destroy. His obituaries mentioned his long career in law enforcement and intelligence, but made no reference to Operation Midnight Climax because the operation was still classified. His diary surfaced later during the investigations, providing a window into his mindset. But the man himself escaped judgment. He's buried in a veteran cemetery, honoured for his service to his country, the darker aspects of that service buried with him. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who oversaw the entire MKUltra program, and who signed off on Operation Midnight Climax and dozens of other unethical experiments, also escaped meaningful consequences. He retired quietly from the CIA in the early 70s, shortly before the revelations that would have made his continued employment impossible. Gottlieb bought a farm in rural Virginia, raised goats, made artisanal cheese, and apparently slept soundly at night despite having directed human experiments that would have fit comfortably in a Nuremberg trial. His neighbours knew him as an eccentric but kindly man who loved folk dancing and had strong environmentalist convictions. They had no idea he'd once run a program that dosed thousands of Americans with powerful drugs without their consent. When journalists finally tracked him down in the 90s, he refused to discuss his CIA work in any detail. He expressed vague regrets about unfortunate excesses, but maintained that the research had been necessary given the threats America faced during the Cold War. He died in March of 1999, age 80, having lived a long life free from prosecution or public censure, beyond some critical articles that most people never read. The sex workers who'd worked in the safe houses, luring men and dosing their drinks on CIA orders, faced more complicated consequences. Most disappeared back into the underground economy, trying to leave this strange chapter of their lives behind them. A few gave interviews years later, when the story became public and journalists sought first-hand accounts. Their testimony was illuminating but often ambivalent. They'd been paid well, treated professionally in some ways, and many of them had genuinely believed they were contributing to important national security work. They'd been told they were helping to protect America from communist brainwashing techniques. They'd been led to believe the men being dosed were all volunteering for experiments, that everyone involved understood what was happening. When they learned the truth, that the men had been unwitting victims, that no consent had been obtained, that the operation was fundamentally unethical from top to bottom, their reactions varied. Some expressed remorse. Others remained defensive, arguing they'd just been following orders and trying to survive in a world that gave women in their profession few choices and little protection. Still others seemed to have compartmentalized the experience so thoroughly that they struggled to engage with questions about its morality. None of them faced legal consequences for their participation. The CIA had given them immunity, and even years later, when the operation became public, prosecutors showed no interest in going after the women who'd been essentially tools of the program rather than its architects. The subjects, the actual victims, received nothing. No compensation, no official apology beyond generic statements that mistakes were made. No acknowledgement beyond the bare admission that yes, this program existed, and yes, it was wrong. Several victims attempted to sue the government for damages. These cases were almost uniformly unsuccessful. The government argued sovereign immunity, claimed that state secrets privilege prevented full disclosure of what had happened, and used procedural manoeuvres to avoid meaningful accountability. Some cases were settled out of court for small sums with strict non-disclosure agreements attached. The government preferred to pay modest settlements rather than allow victims to pursue cases that might result in broader discovery of still classified information or set precedents for future claims. The message was clear. You might have been drugged and traumatized by your own government, but you have no recourse. Power protects itself. The government's position was essentially, mistakes were made, procedures have been improved, oversight is better now, let's move on. But you can't move on from something like this without reckoning with what it means, without holding people accountable, without creating systems that actually prevent similar abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact. The knowledge lives on. Here's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Operation Midnight Climax. The detail that transforms it from historical atrocity into ongoing concern. The research didn't disappear just because the program was shut down and the files were shredded. The CIA learned things about human psychology during Operation Midnight Climax and the broader MKUltra program. They learned how drugs affect behavior under different conditions. They learned techniques for breaking down psychological resistance. They learned methods for manipulating perception and creating vulnerability. That knowledge didn't evaporate when the safe houses closed. It got incorporated into training manuals, interrogation protocols, and behavioral analysis techniques. The specific tactics may have changed. The technology certainly has advanced, but the underlying philosophy remains: study human vulnerability. Catalogue the ways consciousness can be altered and manipulated, then weaponize that knowledge for intelligence purposes. When you read about enhanced interrogation methods used decades later at facilities like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, when you learn about psychological operations designed to disorient and control, when you encounter descriptions of isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and other techniques meant to break subjects without leaving physical marks, you're seeing the legacy of programs like MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax. The through line from a CIA safe house in 1950s San Francisco to modern behavioural manipulation is more direct than most people realise. The knowledge was preserved, the techniques were refined, the applications multiplied. Some of the findings from LSD research made their way into academic psychology, minus the context of how they were obtained. Papers were published about how hallucinogens affect cognition and perception, studies that drew on data from MKUltra experiments without acknowledging that the data came from non-consenting subjects dosed in government brothels. This knowledge then influenced subsequent research, creating a genealogy of scientific understanding built partly on a foundation of unethical experimentation. Other findings influenced advertising and marketing psychology. The understanding of how to bypass rational thought, how to trigger emotional responses, how to manipulate behaviour without subjects fully realising they're being manipulated, these insights have applications beyond intelligence work. Advertisers, political consultants, and social media companies use techniques that owe intellectual debts to Cold War mind control research, though the connections are rarely acknowledged explicitly. The CIA also maintained relationships with researchers who'd been involved in MKUltra. Even after the program officially ended, Gottlieb and others continued to consult on projects related to behavioural control and psychological manipulation. Their expertise remained valuable, their knowledge sought after, their moral compromises forgiven in service of ongoing intelligence needs. This persistence of knowledge and relationships means that Operation Midnight Climax never really ended. It transformed, evolved, adapted to new technologies and changing social contexts. The specific tactic of dosing people in fake brothels may have been abandoned, but the broader project of studying and manipulating human consciousness for intelligence purposes continues. Echoes in the present. When you look at Operation Midnight Climax in historical context, certain patterns become disturbingly clear. The justification was always national security. The threat was portrayed as existential, and the enemy as ruthless, therefore our methods had to match theirs. Oversight was minimal because the threat was too urgent, too dangerous to allow bureaucratic interference or democratic accountability. These are the same arguments that reappear throughout history whenever governments seek to expand their power and dodge accountability. They're not unique to the Cold War or to the United States. They're universal rhetorical moves that authoritarian-leaning officials use in every time and place. The threat is real. The enemy is implacable. We need extraordinary powers to protect you. Trust us. Don't ask too many questions. National security prevents us from explaining in detail, but believe us when we say this is necessary. From Cold War LSD experiments to Vietnam-era surveillance of domestic activists, from post-9/11 warrantless wiretapping to contemporary mass data collection, the tools change, but the logic remains constant. Trust us. It's for your own good. We can't tell you the details, because that would compromise effectiveness, but we promise we're keeping you safe. Operation Midnight Climax proved that conspiracy theories aren't always theories. Sometimes the paranoid fantasy turns out to be documented fact. Your government really did drug citizens without consent. They really did film people in compromising situations for potential blackmail. They really did cover it up for decades. They really did destroy evidence to avoid accountability. And when it finally came to light, nobody was punished. This revelation reshaped public trust in lasting ways. Before the Church Committee investigations, suggestions that the CIA was conducting mind control experiments on Americans sounded like the ravings of paranoid cranks. After the investigations, after the documents were declassified and the testimony heard, those suggestions were proven correct. The cranks had been right. The paranoia had been justified. This doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true. Most aren't. But Operation Midnight Climax demonstrated that dismissing uncomfortable accusations just because they sound outrageous is a mistake. Sometimes the truth is outrageous. Sometimes the people in power really are doing things that would be unbelievable if they weren't documented. The real horror isn't the drugging, yes. Dosing people with powerful hallucinogens without their knowledge or consent is horrifying. Yes, the violation of privacy and bodily autonomy is unconscionable. Yes, the lasting trauma inflicted on victims is a moral atrocity. But the deepest horror of Operation Midnight Climax isn't the specific acts. It's what those acts reveal about power, about institutions, about human nature itself. The men who ran this program weren't cartoon villains. They weren't sadists who enjoyed causing pain for its own sake, though some, like White, apparently did take a certain pleasure in their work. They were government employees, professionals with mortgages and families, people who presumably thought of themselves as patriots serving their country in dangerous times, and they convinced themselves that drugging strangers and filming them in brothels was not only acceptable but necessary. They constructed elaborate justifications, told themselves stories about defending freedom and protecting American security, and managed to sleep at night despite the harm they were causing. That's the real horror. How easily ordinary people can justify extraordinary evil when it's wrapped in the flag and stamped with a classification level. How moral boundaries that seem absolute can dissolve under pressure from authority and peer consensus. How people can compartmentalize, separating the harm they cause from the righteous narrative they tell themselves. White didn't see himself as a monster. In his mind, he was a warrior doing difficult work that soft civilians couldn't understand. He was on the front lines of an existential struggle, where conventional morality was a luxury America couldn't afford. His diary entries suggest not guilt but pride, not remorse but satisfaction, at having found a role where he could operate without constraints. Gottlieb thought he was advancing science and protecting national security. He apparently saw no contradiction between his peaceful persona, the goat farmer, the folk dancer, the environmentalist, and his professional role directing human experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. These two aspects of his life existed in separate mental compartments, neither contaminating the other. The agents watching through two-way mirrors told themselves they were gathering intelligence that could save American lives. The sex workers convinced themselves they were serving their country. The CIA officials who authorized and funded the program believed they were doing what national security required in a dangerous world. None of them seemed to have lost much sleep over the men whose lives they damaged or destroyed, over the families torn apart, over the psychological trauma that rippled forward through the decades. The victims were abstractions, statistics, acceptable casualties in a larger struggle. This capacity for moral compartmentalization, for separating the harm you cause from the righteous narrative you tell yourself, is perhaps the most persistent danger in human affairs. It's how atrocities happen. It's how democracies slide into authoritarianism. It's how good people end up doing terrible things while maintaining their self-image as heroes rather than villains. Operation Midnight Climax is a case study in this process. It shows how institutional culture can normalize the abnormal, how secrecy can insulate people from accountability, how the language of national security can be used to justify almost anything. These aren't problems unique to the CIA or the 1950s. They're structural issues that persist wherever power operates without transparency and accountability. Understanding this is crucial because it means that preventing future atrocities requires more than just punishing individuals who participate in current ones. It requires changing the institutional conditions that make such participation possible and even rewarded. It requires building systems where doing the right thing is easier than doing the wrong thing, where transparency is default rather than exception, where accountability is real rather than theatrical, lessons unlearned, You'd like to think that exposing something like Operation Midnight Climax would prevent similar abuses in the future. You'd like to believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that transparency breeds accountability, that we learn from our mistakes and build systems to prevent their recurrence. But the historical record suggests otherwise. After MKUltra was exposed, after the Church Committee revelations, after promises of reform and new oversight mechanisms, abuses continued. Different agencies, different methods, different justifications, but the same underlying disregard for civil liberties and human rights. Enhanced interrogation programs in the early 21st century employed techniques that descended directly from Cold War psychological research. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, sensory overload and deprivation. These methods were designed to break subjects psychologically without leaving obvious physical evidence. The parallels to MKUltra research are unmistakable. Extraordinary rendition programs kidnapped suspected terrorists and flew them to black sites in countries with fewer restrictions on interrogation methods. These facilities existed in the same legal grey zones that the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax had occupied, places where normal rules supposedly didn't apply because the threat was too great and the circumstances too exceptional. Mass surveillance programs revealed by whistleblowers showed that intelligence agencies were collecting vast amounts of data on American citizens without warrants or meaningful oversight. The justification was always the same: national security, terrorist threats, keeping Americans safe. The programs operated in secret for years, only come into light through unauthorized disclosures rather than official channels. The pattern persists because the underlying conditions haven't changed. We still have intelligence agencies that operate primarily in secret. We still have classification systems that keep most of their activities hidden from public view. We still have oversight mechanisms that are weak, compromised, or ineffective. We still have a political culture that treats national security as a conversation-ending trump card rather than a claim that requires rigorous justification. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of deeper structural problems that remain largely unaddressed. Until we confront those problems directly, until we build institutional safeguards that actually prevent abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact, we'll keep seeing variations on the same theme. The human cost. It's easy, when discussing Operation Midnight Climax, to get lost in the policy debates and historical analysis, to treat it as an interesting case study in government overreach. But behind all of that are real people whose lives were damaged or destroyed, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, but as human tragedies. Think about the man who entered a safe house in his 20s, excited and nervous, who spent the next 8 hours convinced he was dying or going insane, who left that apartment fundamentally changed. He struggled with flashbacks and anxiety for years afterward. Normal situations could trigger overwhelming panic. A mirror in a hotel room, jazz music in a restaurant, the smell of whiskey. His relationship suffered because he could never fully explain what was wrong, why he'd become so jumpy and paranoid. Eventually his marriage collapsed. His career stalled because employers found his behaviour erratic and unreliable. He spent decades trying to put his life back together, never fully succeeding, never understanding why a single night had demolished his psychological foundation so completely. When he finally learned about Operation Midnight Climax in the late 70s, when pieces started to fall into place, and he realised what had been done to him, the revelation brought both clarity and rage. Clarity because suddenly his struggles made sense. Rage because he had spent decades thinking something was wrong with him, when really something had been done to him. But by the time he learned the truth, the people responsible were beyond reach, the evidence was destroyed, and there was no practical recourse. Think about the woman who worked as an asset in the safe houses, bringing men back to the apartments, dosing their drinks, playing her role in the operation. She was told she was serving her country, doing important work. She needed the money. Her criminal record made regular employment nearly impossible. She convinced herself that the men being dosed were volunteers, that everyone involved understood what was happening. When she learned the truth years later, that the men had been unwitting victims, that no consent had been obtained, she was devastated. She'd participated in something monstrous while believing it was righteous. The guilt became crushing. She tried to find the men she'd lured to the apartments, to apologise, to explain, but she didn't know their names. They'd been anonymous to her, just faces that passed through, subjects in an experiment she didn't fully understand. She carried that guilt for the rest of her life, a burden made heavier by the knowledge that she too had been manipulated, used as a tool by people who'd lied to her about what was really happening. Think about the families of men who'd been dosed and never recovered. Wives who watched their husbands transform into strangers, becoming paranoid and erratic for no reason they could understand. Children who grew up wondering why their father was different, why he had episodes where he seemed terrified of nothing, why he couldn't hold down a job or maintain relationships. These families were victims too, collateral damage in an experiment they didn't know existed. Some of these families spent years and small fortunes on medical treatment and therapy, trying to help their loved ones recover from trauma whose source they couldn't identify. They watched as antipsychotics and other medications provided partial relief, but never fully restored the person they'd known. They struggled with their own questions. Was this our fault? Could we have done something different? Why is this happening to us? When the truth came out, these families had their own reckoning. The person they loved hadn't been broken by some mysterious flaw or unexplained mental illness. He'd been deliberately drugged by his own government. The trauma was inflicted, not random. But this knowledge came too late to help in most cases, and there was no one to hold accountable. These aren't abstractions. They're human beings who got caught in the machinery of a program that treated them as expendable. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as cautionary tales or political ammunition, but as reminders of what's at stake when we allow power to operate without meaningful constraints. Where are the tapes? This question haunts researchers and survivors alike. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours of footage and audio recordings were made in those safe houses. Hidden cameras captured everything. Reel-to-reel machines preserved every word. The surveillance was comprehensive, designed to document every detail of how subjects responded to the drugs. The CIA claims all of it was destroyed in the purge of 1973, boxes of film stock incinerated, magnetic tape erased, and then physically destroyed. The claim is that nothing survived, that the complete record of what happened in those apartments went up in smoke or was reduced to confetti by industrial shredders. But people who've studied intelligence agencies for decades are deeply skeptical of this claim. The historical pattern, evident across multiple agencies and countries, is that truly sensitive material doesn't get destroyed. Information that could be used as leverage, recordings that might need to be accessed later, evidence that provides insurance against betrayal, this kind of material gets hidden, secured, kept available even when official policy calls for destruction. Think about the operational logic. If you're holding footage of prominent people in deeply compromising situations, recorded without their knowledge, potentially showing them under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs engaging in behaviour they'd never want made public, you're holding enormous leverage. Why would you destroy that? It's insurance. It's a weapon. It's power in its most concrete form. There are whispers, impossible to verify through official channels, that the tapes didn't all end up in incinerators. Some allegedly found their way into private hands, parcelled out to powerful people as mutual insurance, or traded for favours in the complex economy of secrets that characterises high-level intelligence work. The logic is grimly practical. If you have blackmail material on someone influential, you don't burn it. You secure it, document its existence to the right people, and use that implicit threat to ensure cooperation or silence. There are theories that copies exist in foreign intelligence archives, If any of the people involved in Operation Midnight Climax were recruited by the KGB or other foreign intelligence services, and given the moral flexibility of those involved, this doesn't seem far-fetched. The safe house recordings would have been invaluable. Proof of American intelligence agencies running brothels on domestic soil, drugging citizens, potentially blackmailing officials. That's propaganda gold plus operational intelligence plus blackmail material, all rolled into one package. Nobody knows for sure. The CIA isn't talking beyond its official statement that the materials were destroyed. The people who might know, White, Gottlieb, the agents who worked in the safe houses, are dead or have maintained decades of silence that's unlikely to break now. Foreign intelligence services, if they have anything, certainly aren't sharing. But somewhere, possibly, those recordings still exist. Film footage of men at their most vulnerable, recorded without consent, potentially showing prominent figures in compromising positions. Audio tapes of confessions, rambling monologues, screams of terror, all preserved on magnetic ribbon. If they do exist, they represent an enormous source of potential blackmail. Control over those tapes would mean control over the people in them, and possibly control over the political and economic landscapes those people once inhabited. Even decades later, even with many of the subjects presumably dead, the recordings could still be damaging. Public figures who've built careers on particular images could be destroyed if footage surfaced showing them in situations that contradicted those images. Family members could be embarrassed or manipulated through threats of disclosure. The tapes are Schrödinger's blackmail material, simultaneously destroyed and extant, their status uncertain, but their potential impact enormous. It's entirely possible they were thoroughly destroyed as claimed. It's also possible they're sitting in a vault somewhere, a Pandora's box that nobody wants to open, because the consequences would be too destabilizing, too revealing of how power actually operates beneath the public facade. This uncertainty itself is troubling. The fact that we can't know for certain what happened to evidence of massive government abuse, that the official record has been deliberately obscured, that the people responsible faced no consequences and took their secrets to their graves, all of this represents a kind of ongoing crime. The cover-up continues through silence, through the destruction of records, through the death of witnesses, through the passage of time that makes accountability increasingly impossible. Final thoughts. Operation Midnight Climax stands as one of the most disturbing episodes in American intelligence history, not just for what it was, but for what it represents about power, accountability, and the gap between democratic ideals and actual practice. The program ran for close to a decade. It dosed several thousand men without their knowledge or consent. It was funded by taxpayer money and sanctioned at the highest levels of the CIA. When it finally came to light, the response was a collective shrug followed by promises to do better. Nobody faced criminal charges. Nobody was stripped of their pension or security clearance. Nobody suffered career consequences proportional to the harm they'd inflicted. That should terrify us. Not because we can change what happened, the past is fixed and unchangeable, but because the conditions that allowed Operation Midnight Climax to happen are still largely in place. Excessive secrecy, minimal meaningful oversight, institutional cultures that prize results over ethics, the conviction that intelligence professionals operating in classified environments should be trusted to police themselves, the reflexive acceptance of national security as justification for almost anything. Until we address those structural conditions, until we create systems that actually prevent abuses rather than just investigating them decades after the fact, when everyone responsible is safely beyond accountability, we remain vulnerable to the next iteration of Operation Midnight Climax, whatever form it takes. The story doesn't end with the church committee or the declassified documents. It doesn't end with White's death or Gottlieb's quiet retirement. It continues as long as we tolerate the conditions that made it possible, as long as we accept opacity where we should demand transparency, as long as we defer to authority instead of insisting on accountability. Operation Midnight Climax is history, but it's also a warning, still relevant, still urgent, still demanding, that we pay attention to what's done in our name behind closed doors and classification stamps. Because the men who walked into those San Francisco apartments thought they were just living their lives. They had no idea they were about to become part of a secret government experiment. They had no reason to suspect that their government would do such a thing, until it did. And that's the lesson we can't afford to forget. It can happen. It did happen. And without constant vigilance, without genuine structural reform, without a commitment to accountability that goes beyond performative outrage, it will happen again. The specific tactics will change. The technology will advance. The justifications will be adapted to contemporary threats. But the underlying dynamic, power without accountability, secrecy without oversight, institutional interests prioritised over individual rights, will remain unless we collectively decide that enough is enough and demand better.